nasceu lá na Bahia. Se hoje ele é branco na poesia, se hoje ele é branco na poesia, é negro demais no coração.
Hola, hola. Saludos a todos los que nos están viendo de todas partes del mundo. Bienvenidos a esta jornada de sostenibilidad. Yo soy Sasha Correa. Voy a estar en las siguientes horas con ustedes. Soy venezolana, soy brasileña y me defiendo un poco con el inglés, así que ni se preocupen si cambio de un idioma de un momento para otro. Al final de eso va un poco las lógicas y lógicas de hacer un evento global en un momento como este, en un mundo como este y en una situación tan desafiante como la que estamos viviendo actualmente. So, hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have more than 1,000 people subscribed to this event, so we're more than happy to share with you our best intentions in what we have to offer to all of you watching from everywhere in the world. Para nosotros es un privilegio celebrar esta 9ª jornada de sostenibilidad, que además es la primera que hacemos con Fruto, el proyecto fundado por el chef Alex Atala, miembro fundador del Consejo Internacional del Basque Culinary Center, y Felipe Rimbenboim, un cómplice y ya gran amigo de la casa. Esta jornada, además, es muy especial para nosotros porque significa el 10º año de trabajo conjunto con la Diputación de Guipúzcoa, que sin ellos nada de esto sería posible, además de la oportunidad de estrechar colaboraciones como las que tenemos con MAU o Aquanaria. Y ahora también me gustaría saludar a la gente que está en Brasil específicamente. Alô, alô, Brasil, bem-vindos para essa jornada de sostenibilidade. Para a gente é um privilégio ter vocês aqui. Aí, Alex, Felipe, tudo bem? Bueno, há muito tempo que a gente sonhou com fazer esse evento junto com vocês. Chegou o dia, a gente está muito contente e tomara que todos vocês curtam essa atividade tanto como nós. Y sin más, ahora les dejo con el director de Basque Culinary Center, con José María Isega, para pues ya entrar en materia.
Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Welcome to this moment, to this event, to this gathering. Es un placer. La verdad que organizar este encuentro y además organizarlo, como decía Sasha, en colaboración con Fruto. Hace un año estábamos allí en Sao Paulo y bueno, ¿quién nos iba a decir que hoy íbamos a hacer un evento abierto al mundo? Yo diría aprovechando lo mejor que tiene la tecnología, ¿no? Para hacer comunidad, para reunir a la comunidad gastronómica y abordar temas tan relevantes. Un saludo, Alex, un placer. Felipe, amigos, nada, de verdad que es emocionante organizar este encuentro. Bueno, yo creo que desde Basque Culinary Center somos siempre abanderados de tener una visión global, de tener una visión holística, de tener una visión 360 grados yo diría de prácticamente todo, por supuesto de la gastronomía, pero de cualquier reto, de cualquier problema, somos muy persistentes en decir la importancia que tiene la visión global, ¿no? Y por supuesto cuando uno habla de sostenibilidad, la importancia de tener esta visión transversal. Yo creo que teniendo claro también, desde una esencia, de lo que significa sostenibilidad, que al final, sintetizándola al máximo, pues podríamos decir que es satisfacer las necesidades de las actuales generaciones sin comprometer a las generaciones futuras, ¿no? Tan sencillo como eso, pero tan complejo y tan importante como eso. Y yo creo que desde esa perspectiva, bueno, ya venimos muchos años, ¿no? Muchos años con este debate, con esta llamada a la acción. de hacer frente a los retos de un desarrollo sostenible. Creo que esta llamada a la acción no debería de ser dejada en un segundo plano por la pandemia, por el COVID-19. Al contrario, creo que es el momento de traerlo a primera línea de nuestros actos presentes y sobre todo también en nuestros actos futuros si es que queremos tener un futuro sostenible. Y por eso nosotros desde Basque Culinary Center creo que tenemos interiorizado que desde esa visión transversal, por supuesto, esto es un reto medioambiental que tiene que ver con el cambio climático, que tiene que ver con la escasez de recursos, pero también es un reto social y cultural, porque cuando hablamos de diversidad, no solo hablamos de biodiversidad, hablamos de diversidad cultural, hablamos de diversidad de todo lo que tiene que ver la actividad humana, y yo diría que también es un reto económico y social, ¿no? Y desde estos tres ejes, creo que es desde donde hay que abordar toda la acción, toda la llamada a la acción que cada uno de nosotros podemos desarrollar. Yo creo que en el Basque Culinary Center ya desde nuestros orígenes, por supuesto, hemos traído la sostenibilidad a la formación y en todos los programas formativos, en los talleres, en los proyectos, en las asignaturas, los estudiantes desarrollan conocimiento y competencias vinculadas con un desarrollo sostenible. Tenemos en nuestro centro de investigación una de las 3 líneas de investigación está vinculada con sostenibilidad, o incluso en todo el trabajo que hacemos en innovación, pues hay un equipo de trabajo que está trabajando intensamente en los últimos años en generar nuevos productos, valorizando partes de productos que normalmente se tirarían, descartes, como solemos llamarlo. Y bueno, hoy vamos a tener como ponentes cocineros, expertos, que para nosotros son una inspiración, que son una referencia. Y bueno, con todo ello, yo diría que tenemos muy presente en el día a día lo que nos toca hacer como Basque Culinary Center, ¿no? Porque yo creo que va de eso, cada uno ser consciente en lo que podemos y debemos hacer. Y no solo cada uno, sino sobre todo también quiero reforzar que debemos de hacerlo en cooperación. Y creo que el encuentro de hoy es un ejemplo de la importancia de la cooperación, de la comunidad. Y para nosotros, desde Basque Culinary Center, ¿no? y desde este territorio, quiero también acabar mi introducción pues presentando a una persona que representa una institución con la cual venimos trabajando y cooperando mucho en los últimos años. Yo diría desde el origen de la creación de Basque Culinary Center hace 10 años, que es la Diputación Foral de Guipúzcoa, que es el gobierno de la provincia donde estamos ubicados. Y me gustaría presentar y ceder la palabra a José Ignacio Asensio, que es el diputado de Medio Ambiente de este gobierno provincial. Y quiero acabar reconociendo el trabajo que están haciendo, verdaderamente un trabajo importantísimo a nivel del territorio, y también agradeciendo pues, la cooperación que ya lleva desarrollándose muchos años, materializándose en diferentes proyectos, pero que siempre es un placer colaborar con el Departamento de Medio Ambiente y con la Diputación. José Ignacio, te escuchemos. Eskerrik asko. Muchas gracias. Bienvenidos. Welcome.
Eskerrik asko, Jose Mari, eta, eskertzen dizut zure hitzak, ez? Gaur gazteleraz hitz egingo dut. Decía que muchísimas gracias, Jose Mari, y nuestra colaboración con vosotros, pues es para nosotros un enorme placer, porque de verdad que el basque pues ha posicionado la gastronomía del territorio pues a nivel internacional, ¿no? Y la prueba es que hoy tenemos esta ventana al mundo gracias también al basque, ¿no? Por mi parte, agradecimiento a las primeras palabras, y lo segundo es, tú lo has explicado perfectamente, ¿no? La gastronomía es una de esas fuentes donde lo económico, lo social, lo cultural, lo ambiental, pues tenemos que tenerlo en cuenta, ¿no? Y vosotros, desde el basque, le habéis dado esa categoría universitaria y le habéis dado también una categoría internacional. El que hoy estemos aquí hablando de sostenibilidad, que estemos hablando de gastronomía como herramienta de transformación, pues la verdad es que quizás hace 10 años no era fácil de imaginar, ¿no? Hoy vemos que hoy tenemos un montón de conexiones en este encuentro, una visión y una, como decía antes, una ventana internacional que nos prestáis nosotros, y la verdad es que hay que decirlo todo. Vivimos una situación de mucha incertidumbre, con una situación de pandemia enorme que nos está condicionando a todo el mundo, pero también nos ha abierto esta oportunidad de tener una relación directa a través de estos medios con todo el mundo, y donde tomamos conciencia verdaderamente de lo que es la transformación de todo lo que tiene que ver con nuestras actividades en la vida y en la economía, ¿no? Por supuesto que la gastronomía es una de ellas, y yo no voy a enmendar las palabras de José Mari, creo que lo ha explicado perfectamente, pero han sido 10 años de andadura exitosa, donde desde la Diputación y en este caso desde las instituciones públicas tenemos que simplemente ser facilitadores, reforzar vuestra ciencia y conocimiento, y al mismo tiempo pues intensificar esa colaboración. Creo que todas las colaboraciones que hemos hecho hasta la fecha han sido verdaderamente un grano de arena a esa transformación que íbamos a hablar, ¿no? El programa que tenéis es un programa completísimo, y yo solamente animaros a que disfrutéis de la jornada, que compartamos conocimiento, que compartamos también esta inquietud que nos transmitís precisamente desde el Basque y del resto de los participantes. Y hoy la verdad es que hablar de innovación, transformación, solidaridad incluso, o esa transformación pensando en el futuro, y que todo lo medioambiental pues se haya convertido también en uno de los ejes fundamentales para hacer esa transformación económica y social, pues la gastronomía no puede estar fuera. Todo lo contrario, puede ser una de las actividades que sean pioneras en este ámbito. Por tanto, yo no voy a extenderme más. Animaros a todos a que disfrutéis de la jornada. Nosotros venimos a aprender y a compartir, y sin más, yo desde el País Vasco, desde Guipúzcoa, sabéis que la gastronomía para nosotros es una actividad fundamental desde el punto de vista económico y también cultural, como le decía José Mari, ¿no? Pero sobre todo para unir pueblos, para unir conocimiento y para compartir con todos vosotros esta transformación de la sociedad. Muchísimas gracias.
De traducción simultánea que deseen. Tienen opción para español, para portugués y para inglés. Así que sin más, ¡alô Brasil!
Bom, começamos hoje. Queria agradecer a presença de vocês aí do outro lado. Queria agradecer também a oportunidade de realizar mais esse evento, essa 9ª Jornada de Sustentabilidade, junto com o Basque Culinary Center. Então, agradecer aqui, nós como Fruto e aqui do Brasil, essa colaboração e essa participação aqui. A gente abre explicando um pouquinho o que é o Fruto Diálogos do Alimento e essa jornada especificamente. O tema dessa jornada é o alimento como ferramenta de transformação. Então, a partir disso, a gente vai discutir todos esses pontos onde o alimento passa e essas relações que tem com o homem e o alimento. Nesse sentido, a gente criou a plataforma Fruto, que é um espaço para a gente discutir, dialogar sobre o alimento. A partir desse diálogo gera informação, e a gente acredita que com essa informação transforma em educação, e a partir disso a gente consegue ter uma transformação total. Sem mais delongas, queria passar para o Alex para ele também contar um pouquinho o que é o Fruto, e a gente vai seguir na sequência os nossos palestras.
O Fruto é, antes de mais nada, acho que uma alegria compartilhar, alimentar, ser alimentado, poder trocar possibilidades, ouvir extremos, darem suas opiniões e nós, cada um, a sua maneira, interpretar isso e construir uma nova realidade. O maior paradoxo para a humanidade nos próximos anos é alimentar a todos nós. E, óbvio, a gente não tem uma verdade, a gente não tem uma receita, mas múltiplas receitas, e essa colaboração que nós fazemos, que nós comungamos hoje, pode ser, sim, o caminho de um novo futuro. Para você que está conhecendo o Fruto hoje, se você quiser saber mais do Fruto, acessa o nosso canal no YouTube, FRU.TO. todas as 3 edições do Fruto, todos os palestrantes estão lá gratuitamente, com tradução ou subtitulada para a sua língua. Conhece, aproveita e vamos juntos fazer mais um Fruto Delicioso.
Maravilha. Inclusive, daqui a pouquinho, esse evento também estará lá, traduzido. Então, para a gente dar esse pontapé inicial, estou aqui do meu lado, com a Alex Atala, a gente vai falar um pouquinho sobre a gastronomia e a sustentabilidade. Então, vamos começar aqui, Alex.
Obrigado, Felipe.
Vamos lá.
Obrigado a todos vocês. A gente vive um momento de pandemia e de novas descobertas, e nessas novas descobertas, esses encontros virtuais, e esses encontros virtuais me levam à primeira reflexão. Talvez até fevereiro, março desse ano, a gente conseguia fazer 1 ou 2 reuniões por dia, porque tinha que sair de onde eu estava, talvez do restaurante, para ir em algum lugar. O trânsito, a locomoção na cidade sempre foi um problema grande, e de um dia para o outro esses problemas quase que desapareceram com essas ferramentas de internet, de você poder fazer reuniões, e com isso a gente ganhou mais tempo. E com a sensação de ganhar mais tempo, a gente começou a fazer mais reuniões. E é sensacional que de um dia para o outro, o tempo que antigamente dava para fazer poucas reuniões virou um tempo de muitas reuniões. Tempo de cozinhar, tempo de pesquisar, tempo de aprender, tempo de fazer reunião, de se locomover. O tempo ganha um novo valor. Nesta pandemia, a gente começa a entender como a gente pode usar o tempo. Eu vou trazer essa primeira reflexão para amarrá-la lá no finalzinho, mas eu também quero falar de dinheiro. Um momento duro, esse da pandemia, principalmente para nós de restaurante. E nós, com certeza, como cozinheiros, temos um primeiro compromisso de entregar delícias, mas não dá só para entregar delícias sem pensar em dinheiro. A gente foi treinado para ganhar dinheiro, a gente foi educado para economizar dinheiro, a gente ama dinheiro, e talvez a gente dê um valor ao dinheiro que talvez seja maior do que ele tem. Vou contar isso de uma outra maneira. Vou dar um exemplo. A gente vai viajar para algum lugar e recebe umas moedas, e a gente não joga aquelas moedas fora. Mesmo que você, europeu, venha para o Brasil e a nossa moedinha aqui não valha nada, essa moeda você não joga no lixo. É mais forte do que a gente. É contra a cultura, foi tudo que nos ensinaram, era que a gente não deve jogar nada fora, nenhum dinheiro fora, nem mesmo uma moeda de 1 centavo. Tá certo. O dinheiro é fruto do nosso esforço, é fruto do nosso tempo. Então a gente não deve jogar mesmo dinheiro fora. Agora que a gente entendeu de tempo e agora que a gente entendeu de dinheiro, eu tenho uma pergunta. Por que é que a gente joga comida fora? Se a comida que eu fiz, eu gastei tempo. Se a comida que eu comprei, eu paguei com dinheiro. E que muitas vezes esses 2 valores são muito maiores do que a moeda que você não jogou fora. Acredito que a pandemia desvele os valores, traga a consciência de seres humanos e cozinheiros novos valores. Repensar a nossa relação com o alimento, repensar com o tempo, repensar talvez a nossa relação com o dinheiro. Durante a pandemia, algumas coisas que eu entendia que eu nunca podia viver sem. Eu vou dar um exemplo que talvez muito comum a nós brasileiros e vocês espanhóis, que é o futebol. Nós somos apaixonados por futebol. E de um dia para o outro nós ficamos sem futebol. E entendemos que dá para viver sem futebol. Porém, nós tivemos que reentender e vamos ter que reentender e vamos ter que mostrar isso para o mundo que a gente já não vive mais sem agricultor. Novos valores, a cadeia do alimento começa a se mostrar cada vez mais forte, cada vez mais eficiente. Tem uma frase que eu escutei há alguns anos e repito ela semanticamente, que é: a maior rede social do mundo é o alimento. O homem que trabalha para o alimento talvez seja o grande polo dispersor de cultura, de sustentabilidade, de interdependência. Quero voltar nessa palavra daqui a pouco, interdependência. Nós, seres humanos, muitas vezes falamos de sustentabilidade, falamos de preservação do meio ambiente, falamos de um futuro. Nós também causamos o aquecimento global, a poluição, o plástico nos mares, problemas, a fome. Deixo uma questão, um ponto de reflexão para cada um de nós. Nós esse problema? Acredito que sim. Nós podemos construir um futuro melhor, com certeza. Como? Entendendo a nossa função dentro do planeta. O homem, muita gente diz que o homem está acabando com o planeta Terra. Preciso dizer para vocês uma coisa. O homem não está acabando com o planeta Terra. O homem não está acabando com o planeta Terra. E para ninguém ter dúvida, o homem não está acabando com o planeta Terra. O homem está acabando com a possibilidade de nós, seres humanos, habitarmos o planeta Terra. Se amanhã nós tirarmos todos os homens do planeta Terra, o Sol, a Lua, o mar, as montanhas estarão aqui. Quem não estará? Somos nós. Entender que nós somos uma espécie que interdepende de outras espécies e de fatores climáticos. Entender que a nossa posição no planeta não é de salvador e nem de vilão. É de interação, de comunhão, de entender que a cadeia do alimento reestruturada, realinhada, reposicionada, pode ter sim um impacto para as próximas gerações maior talvez até que a própria internet, que no ato de alimentar reside a educação do paladar, a educação de um cidadão, respeito. Por que é que nós valorizamos tanto o dinheiro e desvalorizamos ou não valorizamos corretamente o alimento? Será porque é fácil plantar? Será porque você pode pegar uma laranja no pé? Será porque os peixes estão aí em volta da gente? Será porque o alimento é um presente da natureza, é um regalo da vida? E que nós muitas vezes subestimamos este valor, não entendemos quem somos e do que fazemos parte. O homem não é dono da natureza, o homem pertence à natureza. E a cadeia do alimento, sim, é a chave para um futuro melhor amanhã. Eu, como cozinheiro, como cidadão, como brasileiro, como sul-americano, sonho com uma nova juventude. Uma nova juventude que saiba usar as redes sociais, que saiba falar no Zoom, fazer conferências internacionais, que seja engajada, que seja consciente, que tenha entre ação e discurso coerência, mas que antes de mais nada seja respeitosa com a natureza. Entender que o futuro, o amanhã, faz parte do hoje, deste momento, que não adianta esperar de governos ou de outras pessoas, de outras organizações, a solução. A solução reside dentro de cada um de nós. Não jogar nada fora, aproveitar o máximo ingrediente, colher respeitosamente, não poluir, cozinhar, combater, são possibilidades que essa nova geração já traz, já faz, e que nós, cozinheiros mais velhos, devemos sim apoiar e talvez mudar alguns hábitos, trazer novas maneiras e olhar para todo mundo e falar: eu não sei se eu estou certo, mas eu estou disposto a mudar. Eu acredito no futuro, eu acredito na humanidade, eu acredito no poder de transformação de cada um de nós. E se tivermos todos que dar um passo para trás, para quem sabe um dia podemos dar 2 passos para frente, é agora o caminho, agora é a hora. Entender valor, tempo e interdependência do homem, do alimento e da natureza. De uma maneira bastante simples, essa é a minha maior mensagem. nesse momento. Posso ir ainda um pouco além e pensar em criatividade, em inovação. Palavras fundamentais para uma cozinha e para um futuro. O que é ser criativo? Ser criativo é fazer o que todo mundo faz, de um jeito que ninguém espera. Uma inovação deve ser essa criatividade com utilidade. Como cozinheiro, eu não quero fazer coisas que só eu posso fazer, ou só o meu restaurante podem servir. Se eu sonho com amanhã melhor e sonho em fazer uma inovação, eu quero criar receitas, métodos, possibilidades que todos nós possamos fazer. Que seja um pequeno caminho, um pequeno passo em caminho em direção de um futuro melhor, de uma cozinha mais equilibrada, mais diversa. E diversa é uma palavra que nós temos que pensar. Primeiro porque não me estarrece, não me assusta, e a maioria das pessoas do mundo nunca tenham experimentado os ingredientes da Amazônia. Não. Isso dessa talvez até me envaideça. O que me assusta, o que congela o meu coração é imaginar quantas pessoas no planeta Terra reconhecem um pé de laranja sem a fruta. Eu não estou falando de nada exótico, eu estou falando de uma fruta que está no mundo inteiro, em todas as mesas, acessível a todos. Eu estou citando a desconexão do homem com o seu alimento, o seu primeiro momento, que é a vida na natureza. Reaproximar, esta relação do alimento e a natureza é fundamental nesse momento. Quero continuar sonhando, quero continuar inspirando, quero continuar sendo inspirado. Eu acho que o momento que a gente vive, começar neste momento, um evento como esse, junto com o Basque Culinário, com um time de chefes e de pessoas que agem pelo alimento, que atuam na cadeia do alimento de vários lugares do mundo, podendo trazer inspiração, faz um grande orgulho para um cozinheiro que foi treinado para cozinhar, que dentro da sua cozinha reconheci a mim mesmo, reconhecendo a minha personalidade, a minha história, o meu passado, a minha cultura. Eu comecei a entender melhor o meu entorno, a minha relação, não só com a panela, mas com o meu fornecedor. E com o meu fornecedor, com a natureza, e com a natureza, com os povos tradicionais brasileiros. E dos povos tradicionais brasileiros, entender um pouquinho mais sobre um planeta. Cozinhar é algo delicioso. Cozinhar é alguma forma de expressão. Cozinhar, sem dúvida, é amor. E eu acredito que nós precisamos alimentar pessoas, alimentar o mundo com amor. E talvez a comida seja uma forma de alimentar o mundo com amor. Quero agradecer a cada um de vocês, com muito carinho, com muito orgulho, estar aqui nesse momento no Basque Culinary Center, fazendo uma 9ª jornada de sustentabilidade e podendo dividir esse palco com você, com vocês, com chefes, com essa alegria que é poder se conectar com o mundo sem sair de casa. É assim o novo futuro, que ele seja delicioso, com um alimento bom, limpo, honesto. Eu sei para todos nós. Muito obrigado.
Gracias, Alex. Qué gusto verte, compartir con nosotros todas las claves para introducir esta reflexión en las profundidades que merece y bueno, y que estemos sumando esfuerzos hoy para esto, ¿no? A continuación tenemos a un chef estupendo y maravilloso del que hemos aprendido un montón, que se llama Matt Orlando y desde Dinamarca nos va a contar cómo entiende que hay que adecuarse y adaptarse a los tiempos de hoy desde la consigna de la sostenibilidad. Son tiempos desafiantes, son tiempos difíciles, pero no por ellos tiempos menos abiertos a la creatividad y a la fuerza de chefs como Matt. Bienvenido, Matt, a nuestra jornada.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this. So, you didn't tell me I was following up Alex. A lot of pressure there. So I wanted to start, we were shut down for 3 months here in Copenhagen, and it was the first time in my career that I had time to really step back and look at what our industry was and where we were going, and where were we going as a restaurant at Amass, but I think most important, where were we going as an industry. And we always talk about the techniques that we use to upcycle side streams and the flavor and deliciousness, which are the most important. But something we don't really talk about a lot is the psychology of sustainability. And that is something that I've really started to dig into deep with my team and trying to understand what is the psychology of being a sustainable restaurant, what's the psychology of being a sustainable industry, and what's the psychology of having a sustainable society. I think to start that conversation, you need to start with a couple words that Alex actually used multiple times in his talk, habits and awareness. And we as an industry have horrible habits in regards to sustainability. We're an industry, we have such a long history of it as an industry, and this industry is so focused on what is on the plate. And all the effort is put into what the final product on the plate. And there's very little attention paid to the journey to get to that plate. And when you stop for a second and start to analyze the journey, that's when you start this process of changing your mindset or becoming aware. And awareness is, I would say, one of the most important parts of the whole equation here. And I don't feel I was totally aware until the pandemic hit and we were forced to take a step back and just really analyze what is happening to our industry, how are we working, and then to kind of see these little glimpses out there in the world, why the world was shut down, of harbors becoming clean or cleaner within months, and insects coming back to certain parts of the cities, and birds coming back to certain parts of forests that they had left. And it really starts to make you think about the impact that we're having. So this changing your mindset is the first step to all of this. And that is also the most difficult step in this whole equation of sustainability. We've been operating at Amass pretty aggressively within this realm. We've been open for about 7.5 years, but we've been operating pretty aggressively within this realm for about 5 years. And we've made huge strides in reducing our CO2 footprint and just reducing our impact on the environment in general. But none of that would have been possible without this this drive to be aware of what's happening around you. And I'm going to keep saying awareness, 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 because it is the most important part of this change of mindset. Because a lot of people out there aren't aware of the processes that happen. And Alex also talked a lot about, there's a lot of time and money spent on these processes that a lot of chefs aren't even aware of. And these processes give value to what you use. And as soon as you become aware of these processes, everything that you do becomes more valuable. and you start to strive to find ways of giving respect and value to these products that you're using, whether it's taking the leaves off something and using the stems and fermenting it and turning it into something. That's the easy part of this, but it is about becoming aware of everything around you and the effects that you might have on certain things and the environment. So for me, I'm gonna look at my cheat sheet here. You know, it's kind of it's like the quintessential thing when you talk about a drug addict going through recovery. You know, the first part of recovery is to admit that you have a problem. We as an industry and we as individual restaurants need to start admitting that we have a problem. And we can't start the healing process within our industry and moving forward as a more responsible industry unless we start to address, or unless we face up to the ways that we're working now, and we come clean. And this is going to take a certain degree of showing vulnerability within our industry. So I would have to say that there's a word that I never thought I'd be using as much as I do now, and that word is data. And data is the only way you can actually make huge strides towards moving in this direction. Because if you don't understand what you're doing and the impact that you're having while you're doing it, then you can't make calculated decisions to do it. I remember when we, must have been 6 years ago, we got our first CO2 reading done. And we were already working in this mindset, and maybe not as aggressively, but we were definitely, in my mind at that time, taking strides to move in this direction. And so I thought, oh, we're going to get our first CO2 reading. We're going to absolutely kill it. We're going to be so strong. We're going to really blow a normal restaurant CO2 reading out of the water. That first CO2 calculation came back, and we were barely below what a normal restaurant operates at. And that was a huge eye opener for me. And I really dove deep into that assessment with the group that did the assessment for us. And it wasn't until that deep dive that I took with them on really analyzing every single output of CO2 and how it came to that, and the processes that went into that, and what processes give what amount of CO2. And if you alter that just a little, it has huge impact. It wasn't until I went through that process that I truly understood where you could turn the dials and pull the strings to actually start to reduce your impact on the environment drastically. I mean, fast forward 5-6 years, and we have reduced our CO2 output by almost 40% of that of a regular restaurant. And that would have not been possible. Sorry, friends at the window. That would have not been possible without this knowledge that I had gained through going through this process of collecting data. You know, data does take time, and it does take money to collect. But you know what? When you start to collect and understand that data, and you start moving in this direction, you can actually save money. I mean, the amount of water that we save every day in the restaurant based on the processes we use, that saves us a ton of money at the end of the year. So there's definitely quite a monetary value to this way of working. You know, it takes work to get going in this direction. And you need to be willing to make some sacrifices up front. And, you know, a lot of people say, okay, you've put such limitations on what you're doing. Does that limit your creativity? And I say, actually, no, it is forcing us into realms that actually expand our creativity. You know, when you operate in a sense where everything is available and you can order any type of vegetable at any time of year, then your creativity is actually diluted. Whereas if you put yourself and you force yourself into a corner and allow yourself certain things to operate with and nothing else, that is when you enter a whole new part of the creative process. I'm a true believer that limitations create new ways of thinking. And that is, we really, I mean, my staff will tell you first and foremost that I definitely force all of us into very uncomfortable situations in regards to the creative process. But that's okay, because that forces us to actually find things that if we would have taken the easy route out, we would have never found those ways of doing things. And generally those ways of doing things are not only more exciting, but most importantly, delicious. You know, a lot of people out there are really pushing the sustainability agenda, and that's great. And I'm happy that this is a conversation that we're having more regularly. But one thing that is really important to remember is that unless you can deliver a really superior product and an experience, whether you're operating an upscale restaurant like we are, or you're developing products to be sold as retail, all of us who are involved in this movement have a responsibility to each other. And that responsibility is to really strive to create the best products possible. Because the worst thing, and I've run into this so many times, is that when you go out to, or you could be in the grocery store and then you see this bar that says, oh, this is made out of upcycled beer grains, and it's made out of old bananas that we're going to be thrown away, and blah, 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 blah. And you take, I'm sorry, Rachel, can you, thank you, sorry. I'm in the dining room and we're about to start service in 15 minutes. But if you don't create a product that isn't delicious, and I buy this bar and you eat it and it's actually disgusting, you've actually set us all back in the vision that we're trying, or the agenda that we're trying to push. Because now a normal person that isn't thinking in this way buys that bar thinking, oh, I'm going to give this a go, I want to do the right thing. They eat that bar and it's disgusting. Now we've all taken a step backwards, because that one person took a chance to try to expand their horizons, and the one chance they've taken, they were disappointed. It's going to take a lot more effort to get that person to come back into this realm that we're operating in. And it's going to take a lot more effort to get that person to change their mindset. So that's kind of, I mean, we talk about this all the time at the restaurants, that we have a responsibility to deliver an exceptional experience and have people come here because it is delicious food, amazing wine, and a great atmosphere, because we have a responsibility to prove that this is the right thing to do. And you don't have to compromise on anything to do it. In fact, you can actually enhance the experience, because you're offering a great experience, but you're also offering that person the satisfaction of making a responsible decision on either going to a restaurant or eating this bar that has less of an impact on the environment. So I think what it comes down to, a lot of, we struggle a lot with communication still. And we're some years into this process. And, I think the best piece of advice is that we need to stop referring to all these byproducts and side streams that we're using and upcycling into delicious items. We need to stop referring to them as trash, garbage, or waste, because those three words have a very negative definition to them. And so if we keep calling them that, it devalues what they really are. And they are flavor. They're a product. They're not waste. They're not trash. If you can turn them into something delicious and give them value, then they're not trash. So I think what I would maybe like to end with is that, if you're choosing to aggressively go down this path and make this conscious decision to operate in this way, then you also have to be aware that you have a responsibility to everyone else that is going in this direction. You have a responsibility to yourself. You have a responsibility to the environment. You have a responsibility to the world. And unless you can accept that responsibility, I think you should really think hard about kind of what you're getting yourself into. And I don't say that in a trying to discourage anybody from doing this, because this is the way we all need to move forward. but it needs to be for the right reasons. And I'm so happy to be a part of this conference because I know everyone here is really wants to drink the Kool-Aid and be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So thank you very much, Basque Culinary Center, for letting me be a part of this. Thank you, Fruta. Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure. And like Alex said, technology has really expanded my mind and given us the opportunity to really connect with a lot of people. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. It is amazing to hear you as always, and it's incredible how right you are when you give importance to words and the meaning, that things end up having because of the words that we choose to describe food as waste. You're exactly right, and it's not then about being creative, but about being responsible. And connected with this idea of you, I would like to ask Tracy Chang to join us into the conversation, because she will, I'm sure she will take this reflection farther. She has been working in Boston from Pagu, her restaurant, in the midst of this pandemic, trying to find ways to connect business owners to the crisis so that they use their creativity to be responsible and keep their businesses running. But this is not the only reason that we invited her today to take part of this conference, but also because from that experience of her, I wanted to ask Tracy, when it comes to sustainability, or to try at least to be sustainable, do you think the restaurant industry is sustainable? Can we shape it into a more sustainable system? Welcome, and thank you for joining us from the United States.
Thank you, Sasha. All right. Yeah, that's a very good point, very good question in terms of the future sustainability of our industry. I wanted to go over kind of what we've been doing at my restaurant, Pagu, in Cambridge, Massachusetts here for the past few months since COVID hit our neighborhoods in March. And hopefully we can explore that question together. All right. So before COVID, this is what life looked like at Pagu. There were no masks. There were a lot of events. We were at the peak of our kind of little restaurant existence in this hub. And we were doing weddings, corporate banquets, wine dinners. And, life pre-COVID was really about feeding people who want to eat. People who can afford to eat, people who had read about our restaurant and traveled from Spain to Boston, or from, Sao Paulo or Copenhagen to Boston, and they wanted to come eat here. We served the community. That's what we said. We were about food, community, and collaboration. And what that meant to me was, to put something delicious, put something socially responsible, something humanely raised on the dinner plate, on the table, to share that, to share those experiences, to share the stories of the makers with these people. We held a lot of events with our friends in Harvard Science and Cooking, with winemakers, with sake producers, etc. And that's what food, community, and collaboration used to mean to us. And since COVID hit in March, that's really transformed. There's a picture here of me in the restaurant. It looks very different. There's a photograph of the grocery market that we started, turned kind of into this e-commerce business. There's a picture of pizza because everybody eats pizza, right? We really transitioned to feeding people who need to eat. So what does that mean? You know, Pagu was always supposed to be a place for everyone, whether you're a student or a professor or a young entrepreneur, an artist, a visiting, you know, scholar or tourist. And you know, and then life changed very dramatically in March, and we never actually shut down in terms of serving our community. It's just that we had to redefine what it meant to serve our community. And as a chef, as a restaurant owner, as a community member and organizer, to me, that meant feeding the people who need to eat. So at the front lines, you know, of COVID in March, there was a need to feed frontline healthcare workers. COVID-19 had spread very quickly, very rampantly in Boston, in Cambridge, pretty much throughout the Northeast. Boston, New York were in very, very difficult positions. How did I know about that need? My father is a pediatrician. I have a lot of friends who work in sciences, and they were the ones telling me that, you know, these hospitals are becoming inundated with patients. And so I got an email from one of my regulars, and she had this idea and this name called Off Their Plate. And it was a very simple idea. It was to feed frontline healthcare workers and employ restaurant employees to do so. And that way, restaurants, which we anticipated would be hurting for the next 18 to 24 months, even more, you know, they were going to be in a crisis very soon. And so how could we help, you know, both parties, right? How could we maintain the supply chain, the sustainability of the supply chain? We were saying that, you know, flowers flying off the shelves and toilet paper, you know, but people weren't really buying this produce and this meat and, you know, these other ingredients. And we wanted to make sure that our local farmers, our suppliers, our purveyors, you know, that the chain didn't stop. And so we developed this recipe. $10 was one meal. Okay, how many other restaurants could we get involved in Boston? How many other restaurants could we get involved in New York City? San Francisco is getting hit, LA, Chicago, Seattle, all these major cities where I had friends, and Natalie, my co-founder and friend, had friends. And so we thought, okay, well, let's create a system. Let's create a recipe, a template, standard operating procedures that everyone can follow regardless of which city they're in, and they can also feed their communities. Because if we're just feeding people in Boston, that's great. That's a good starting point, but why don't we create something a little bit more scalable? And very quickly, between March and July, that turned into 200 plus volunteers in just this organization in 9 cities nationwide, over $6 million raised from individual donors, from corporations, from, you know, folks pretty much all over the world, as very creative fundraising tactics, I must say. There was the Goo Goo Dolls who wanted to throw a virtual concert. There were young high school students reaching out to our organization saying, I want to donate my prom dress money to help you raise money to feed these people in the hospitals, in the healthcare centers. And they're not just doctors and nurses. There's people that clean the hospital. There's hazmat. There's, you know, all kinds of folks in the front line. We partnered with World Central Kitchen, with Jose Andres and Nate Mook, to be our physical sponsor. And it was just incredible how quickly we could mobilize our, you know, local and national communities to do this. And we were able to do it because we had a solid recipe. This was a photograph I took one of the first days, that we prepped, you know, just 90 meals to Brigham and Women, right? People say, how do you start something like that? How do you get everyone on board? How do you activate folks to do this? And during a time where,
there's so many unknowns. You don't know if people are safe doing this. How do you guarantee they're safe doing this, right? And so we talk to scientists, we talk to doctors, we talk to public health experts about how we could be as safe as possible. And we continued that conversation, made sure that we had the PPE, made sure that we were creating these procedures to be as responsible as possible and not be part of the problem. And this recipe worked in terms of, people were able to follow this nationwide, and they shared the same mission. They wanted to help. And it was probably in our advantage to be one of the first movers. And I must say that we were different from some of the other organizations that you might have heard of, feeding the front lines or frontline foods. Mostly because, I, as a restaurant owner, I said, this is important that we ask these restaurants and ask their essential workers, what do they need? Right? We know that they can cook food and get it to a hospital, and that they can do that in a short time window and at an incredible, volume. But what do they need from us? Like, yes, they need the $10 per meal. So how many meals do they need per week to make sure that this makes sense for their employees, that this makes sense for their business? And so I developed an economic, model, a very simple one-page spreadsheet that calculated that. That was a tool for these restaurants to all tell us how many meals they need to make each week so that their employees can be okay. They can continue to have these employees on their payroll, have these employees coming in. And I think it was a combination of timing and luck and just some common sense. But really, it was the power of the community and these networks that helped us be as successful as we were. And thankfully, the need declined eventually for healthcare feeding. But we realized that there was another growing need. These essential workers, these restaurant employees, these hospitality employees, these immigrants, they still needed our help. And actually their families were becoming COVID positive, were becoming food insecure. And so with another friend, Marina Lin, Irene Lee, Lily Huang, we created this second initiative in May called Project Restore Us. And we thought, okay, how can we take, that kind of model off their plate? And how can we tweak it and make it, a little bit better, a little bit different, right? And so we still need to help these restaurant employees, help these restaurants stay afloat. The need is actually for these families to be fed. But these families, they have elders, they have diabetic, safety was even more important. So we had volunteers delivering food door to door. We realized that some, pickup locations where people were just bulk dropping off meals or receiving meals on the weekends, they were creating bottlenecks. Everyone was, not 6 feet apart, and that 6 feet is completely arbitrary. So we recreated, a better recipe to reach these families in need. $45 gave us 35 pounds of food, fed one family of 4 for 1 week. Since May, we have fed over 800 families, 150,000 pounds of food. We've brought on 4 restaurants, all owned by female immigrants, people of color, and we've had over 50 volunteers drive these culturally appropriate groceries door to door to each household. And really, it's a matter of caring, and it's a matter of designing these boxes to make sure that it makes sense for a Chinese family, and that a Chinese family might not be receiving the exactly same box as, say, a Haitian or a Latinx family. And as a chef, usually we design dishes, not grocery boxes, right? But I must say, like, it's extremely satisfying to design a grocery box that is culturally appropriate, within budget, and really going a longer way than just one meal at a time. This is feeding people for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. And so now we're in November and COVID is still rising in the US as it was in March. And people are still without jobs, or people are with 2 to 3 jobs. They're as desperate as ever. And this need continues. And, you know, it really makes me rethink the role of chefs, of restaurant owners, of cooks, employees, our neighbors, our community members, of these corporations. All of these people have banded together during this time to do something for the greater good, to feed people in need, not just people who want to eat, right? My friend Eric Bruner Yang here created the Power of 10 initiative. There's so many other organizations that have sprouted up during these COVID times. And you might be wondering, how do you do something like this in your community? And these are kind of my takeaways. You know, surround yourself with people that are motivated to do this kind of work, to solve these problems, to figure out, you know, the difficult answers sometimes, and to ask more questions, to listen to the science, and to be focused on safety at all steps along the way. And importantly, very, very importantly, is to listen to the feedback and be flexible, right? Like, we're not just prescribing what we think people need and however amount of food we think people need. We're actually partnering with organizations who have been around. They know these families. They have surveyed them to understand their need. And we're getting feedback after we send out these grocery boxes. Was that enough food? Did that food make sense? You know, is it nutritious? It doesn't make sense for, you know, diabetics? Does it make sense for elderly? Does it make sense for celiac, etc.? And we've actually found that our food, you know, what we originally say budgeted for 4 weeks, actually lasted 5 weeks. And so, you know, there's valuable feedback there, and listening is so important. And if you develop these, you know, as I say, kind of recipes, these standard operating procedures, these SOPs, you can train other people how to do this. You can scale this. You can empower other people. And all you have to do is start small in your neighborhood and have, you know, a bigger vision to grow it outside of, you know, just the 4 walls of your own restaurant. And I think what's important is that we as restaurant owners, you know, what is the root of restaurant? The root of restaurant is to restore, right? The etymology of restaurant is to restore. And how will we as restaurants, as chefs, restore our environments? You know, people ask us all the time, will you continue these initiatives post-COVID? What will new normal look like for restaurants, for chefs? And I think all that has changed. I had no idea I would be starting 2 nonprofits in my 30s. It's like, oh yeah, one day, you know, I'll do that in my 50s, 60s. I mean, I guess I don't really know what I plan to do in my 30s. I didn't, you know, winning awards isn't like what I wake up and try to do every day. And it's not even really about like making a beautiful plate of food and creating something new on that plate every day. Really, it's really about the people, right? It's about taking care of other people. That is what gives me joy. And to know that we, as chefs, as restaurants, as community members, as humans, can take care of people because people always need to eat. That is what gives me joy. And that is what, you know, new normal looks like for me. And so, you know, we plan to continue these initiatives post-COVID for as long as needed. And we hope that other restaurant owners, that other game changers, other community members take on that responsibility as well and put safety first. Thank you.
So thank you, Tracy. Thank you to share with us all your Restore project and all your thoughts and examples to us. So we're very glad to have you here with us. Now I'm gonna go to another issue, another theme in our projects here. So I'm gonna call to Ciro Gouveia, our dearest friend from Zimbabwe, to talk about social innovation. So it's very important, and food, we're thinking here that food is an empowering tool to change, not only for each one, but also for a whole society. So please have Ciro with us. Hi, Ciro.
Hello.
Hi, the word is yours, please. Nice to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you also, Felipe. So, I feel very happy to be able to join this meeting and to contribute towards it. And when I was reflecting on what I would share about, especially after having gone through all the different challenges and opportunities that 2020 has had to offer, I thought I would start by just reflecting on what I see today as the seeds of hope and resilience for a better future, given everything that we're going through, and also in the context of what this period, what this experience of 2020 means for us in Zimbabwe and on this part of the world, and for me as a person. And two things stand very prominently in what I think is seeds of hope and resilience, given the world we're living in today. And of course, food was something that I was realizing at a very, very young age. And you can see it through all the work that I've done with the Future of Hope. And today, I think what I've been reminded about again is community. These two things have been very, very important. And I think in this, going through this year, one of my moments of experiencing community was actually happening in my own community in Christiansburg, where I live. I've been living there for the past 5 years. And because of everything that is going on in our world today, I was reminded of that power of community in harnessing hope and resilience for a better future. And I was telling my friends about how because COVID, because the world was, because lockdown, because I was not going anywhere, I was not running to the next trip, the next meeting, I was at home. And for the very first time, I got to meet my neighbors because they were coming over to my gate to buy corn, to buy mushrooms, to buy vegetables, and to ask for everything that I can produce. And it was very, very, very clear that for me personally, I think COVID came to remind me of why I do the work that I do and why I should increase my efforts of making this better, of reaching. And so reflecting on what is my community and what from it can actually contribute towards hope, towards resilience, given the context in which I work and live. The experiences with COVID-19 today have really made it stronger, made the need for working on food and community much stronger, and that the efforts, the shape that our efforts has to take has become also very clear. And I just go back to how I usually tell about the mission of the Future of Hope, which is an organization through which we work with different communities here around Zimbabwe, where the main thing that we're doing is really harnessing the power of mushrooms as a source of food, harnessing the power of mushrooms as a source for, as a fertilizer for food production in general. I always say that our job is to capacitate, to collaborate with, to support and to mentor marginal and vulnerable members of society. But today, it's more important to collaborate towards strengthening our communities, collaborating towards building food systems that will carry us through the different challenges that we're experiencing. And I have really grown to appreciate the power of collaboration. The power of collaboration, because when you look at our world today, when food is the center of driving hope and resilience, we need to shift how we think about food. We need to shift our limitations of where we stand in the whole story about food. I always share stories about why collaboration is so important for me. Why do I talk to chefs when I'm a farmer? Why do I encourage our farmers to talk to chefs when all they should just do is farm? And collaboration on that level for me has afforded me to open up, also to help the communities where we work with, to open up to the different possibilities that are in their environments. I always share stories of when I worked in Ghana, for example, and I was teaching about mushrooms. And everybody thinks, Bob, why mushrooms? There are better things. Why don't you tell us about how to make white rice, how to get more white rice, or other, commercialized things that, you have to pay money to get. And one of the funniest experiences, and I always refer to that photo laying somewhere in my collection, where the word for mushrooms, with what that one group I worked with, directly translated to poor men's food. And when probing into that issue to try and say, why would you have a name for mushrooms that translates to poor men's food? It was just very bluntly, because you don't pay money to get it. And so, in my experience, it has become clear that these aspects of collaboration, and in our case, it's really this relationship that leads to this meeting today, where as a farmer, I'm able to talk to people who are working with food on a very different level to what I am doing, because I have seen it to rebuild, to bring back the dignity that is supposed to exist in our farmers, where by experiencing, through collaborating with chefs, they get for the first time convinced that what they are doing is something important. They can shift from that thinking that we are not convinced to grow it unless we know how to eat it. Because they didn't really have a good idea of how to eat mushrooms, because what's sold every day, what they interact with every day is, that when you've made it in life, you eat white rice and you go to pay for white rice. And today our work is really pushing our collaborations that we've been pushing in the last couple of years, and also really been strengthening, is that we want to bring back the dignity to food production. Is life of hope and resilience. Then we need to get to that point where it is not something that I do because I have no other option, but it is something that I do because I know that it plays a very, very important role in making a future that is full of hope, a future where everyone can contribute, a future where everyone can have a dignified livelihood. Another aspect that I find that we can and must address through collaboration is really that having respect. Again, referring to the story of mushrooms, another story which is also more recent is when we started a collaboration that worked with wild fruits from different areas around Zimbabwe. You arrive at a household and they have this fruit and they say, oh, but this is useless, it's not important. And the moment you start through different collaborations, you start showing value, then you really build towards people respecting what is locally available to them and you surprise them with things that they already have. They already know that these things exist, but they didn't know that element of surprise, which I think through collaboration with chefs, we are able to deliver that and to bring, again, that dignity towards what is locally available, what is in our culture, what is in our local environment that is so valuable, but sometimes we're just so busy and sidelined by other things to notice. And when I look at what we're doing today with this understanding of the importance of food, the importance of building communities, certain issues are sticking out in the context of Zimbabwe. In the last couple of years, we've seen several droughts, one after another. As a result, water shortages and even just issues of access to resources have just become such a big challenge in our world. And as a future of hope, reflecting on what it takes to build community, what it takes to build strong food systems that really help drive towards this hope and resilience. We've been busy working to shift how we do what we do. Our story with mushrooms has always been start where you are and use what you have. And yet today, building food systems is not something that we can only do around people who are doing the conventional agriculture, but it's something that we have to bring to the city. When you look at what is happening in Zimbabwe today, I mean, according to the UN and according to what we experience when we go on the field, more than 80% of the population in Zimbabwe today is in need of food aid. And understanding this, we are faced every day with this challenge of strengthening this part that is an important seed for nurturing hope and for achieving resilience. And we've decided as an organization that our work today has to focus really on improving the capacities of people to be able to produce the food where they are. And at the same time, you look at issues of water as a result of the droughts. We are going to farm. We're going to teach people to grow food in areas where they don't even have potable water. And so the question of how we adapt, how we adjust what we do to match all these different challenges that people are facing today is becoming more and more an important issue we have to solve. And again, the aspects of community, the aspect of collaborating and combining different efforts to arrive at achieving that food is available, food, which is what is important for driving hope and resilience, is available, has been one of our major challenge now in the past couple of months. We've had to look at, yes, we've been teaching people to farm mushrooms, but how are they farming? What challenges are they facing? And the last couple of months, we've seen ourselves really working towards improving access. Where normally would go and teach people just to produce, we are looking at how do they get the materials that they need, from the agrobiomass to the hydrated lime that they need, and how do they manage when there's lockdown. And so in the last couple of we've worked around shops in the communities that we work to make sure that all our farmers that we train can have access to the raw materials that they need. We've had to also wake up to the different conflicts that are arising as a result of this dependency on aid, because when aid is coming, it's not reaching everybody. And when I am chosen to receive aid and my neighbor is not receiving aid, that also becomes a challenge in all these different activities happening in the community. And we've had to move from building mushroom houses out of plastic to building them out of tin houses, because we realize when one gets a mushroom house and the neighbor doesn't get, the conflict can result in this plastic mushroom house being burned down if it is not in metal. So there's a lot of issues where we are learning for the very first time that we need to adapt our approaches. And so the part of redefining our focus, focusing on really understanding the communities where we work in, understanding their needs and connecting better to them, and trying to help them navigate through this as a community, trying to get them to work together, to getting to that point where they all feel like they can sail through this, they will survive this harsh period that is around us now. And another important aspect is that to build resilience, oftentimes the Future of Hope operates as an NGO. Oftentimes the NGOs, we're just jumping in to help. We do what the people need to survive today. If it's giving handouts, we give handouts, but not really thinking about what happens then. And I think the work of the Future of Hope today is also pushed because of everything happening to really rethink resilience in that aspect where we are saying it is important for us to also have a business focus. And in the last couple of months, again, we've been working to group all our farmers into a community in the form of an association, so that together they can mobilize resources, together they can also mobilize markets, but also to just build this cohesion around people who are doing the same things as a way of continuing that spirit of promoting community and promoting that people work together. So, sorry. So we are finding that we're having to continuously adjust because the world around us is changing, the environment around us is changing as well. It is for us, I mean, just thinking to end this presentation, one of the most important things that I'm very excited about is that by being here shows that I'm part of a community that is helping to promote this effort of sustainable food, because it's very, very important. A community that can help people to, someone mentioned earlier that food is the largest social network. And I think where we are faced with this challenge of rebuilding community in the face of challenges, food plays a very important role, and that we are all connected, from those who produce food, those who process the food, those who promote efforts around food in general, that we are connected in our efforts, and that we continuously reflect together to see how we can be better, how we can reach more. Is something that means a lot to me as well. And I have a lot of hope that through this community, as we are meeting here, we as the Future of Hope, we as individuals in our respective places, we can really harness the power of this community and our experiences in food to make this world a better place, to promote hope and resilience. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Chido. It's a pleasure to have you. And from Zimbabwe, we're going to go now to Switzerland. And because, as Chido said, food is such a strong connection, it's such a pleasure to have with us Hernan Manson. We were supposed to have Pamela with us from the International Trade Center, but instead we have Hernan with us, and we are more than happy because he manages the Alliance for Action work stream, which is part of the Inclusive Agribusiness Program of the International Trade Center, a joint agency of the United Nations and World Trade Organization. Hernan has been involved in promoting food systems all over the world in places like Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific regions, connecting with producers and food artisans. So let's hear what he has to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Buenas tardes a todo el mundo. Boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure for us as the International Trade Center to be part of this very important meeting. We would like to start by first thanking on behalf of our Executive Director, Mrs. Pamela Coke-Hamilton, the chef Alex Atala and our long-standing partner Jose Mari from the Basque Culinary Center for organizing this and for the invitation. In terms of the ITC, for those of you who don't know it, we are a United Nations organization. We work with the UN and we are also part of the World Trade Organization. And we are a specialized agency working with micro, small, and medium companies. MSMEs, micro, small, medium companies, are quite important when we are looking at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is because when we count the MSMEs, the women and the youth, they account for around 80% of the jobs created worldwide. Most importantly, small, micro, medium companies, food artisans, and farmers are really the backbone of the food systems we are talking about today. Now, let me start by basically reflecting a bit on what I've heard. Really, the speakers before were extremely interesting and hitting on the main topics of this colloquium. I heard about the role of the chefs as an important one in feeding the world. This was Chef Alex Atala who said that as a keynote. I've heard Matt talking about the role of the chefs as the ones who raise awareness, who are actually communicating and telling the story, but most importantly, raising awareness, which is linked to changing behavior or which is linked to essentially sustainability. I also understand that the roles of the chefs is about making choices. And it is about, as Matt was saying, providing excellent experience or excellent services. Now, linking with what Chido was saying earlier, how is it that the chefs can feed the world, raise awareness, or feed the world in a healthy way, raise awareness in a true way? How is it that they can make the right choices? And how is it that they can provide excellence in the experience to the consumers? And here we come with the most important point, which is about the connections. Everybody is talking today about the shrinking the distance between farm to fork or between consumer or fork to or farm to table. This is a very, very important objective. Now, what happens when the ingredients that the chefs are using are, for example, coming from thousands of kilometers away? And I show you this example here. I don't know if you can see this. This is a nutmeg, which is essentially a spice. Many of you might use it in the cooking. Now, this nutmeg is coming from Grenada, a small island in the Caribbean. Total population, 100,000 inhabitants. 33,000 depend on nutmeg and are essentially in the farming of nutmeg and many other crops. So how is it that the chef can connect farm to table in this case, right? How is it that the chef can understand or be sure that this product is actually produced according to the values in a sustainable way, generating good incomes and essentially in a positive way for human beings, for the livelihoods, for the environment, and of course for the economy. And I think this is part of the dilemma of what I wanted to talk to you today. The chefs cannot do this alone. The chefs and everybody in this Congress is talking about the idea of having gastronomy as a tool for transformation. It certainly is a tool for transformation, and we at the ITC believe that it is a pillar not only of the food system but of human life, and it has a tremendous power to generate development. But it must be development that connects, again, the whole system, starting from the farm all the way down to the consumer. And for this, we need partnerships. And this is my first point in relation to what we need to do. And not one stakeholder alone, perhaps the farmers or the farmer association, as Chido was saying, or the NGOs, or the food artisans and processors, or the chefs can do it by themselves. Now, this is a bit the key thing. Partnerships are critical, and this is a bit what we try to do at the International Trade Center. Sasha, you spoke about the Alliances for Action. Partnerships, alliances for action, and this is a bit the point. With this networked approach, linking producers, consumers, chefs, coming up with a common vision, and then essentially agreeing on what can be done and what are the gaps, and communicating about this, are critical steps in order to achieve development that is good for all. And that is my second point. It is really about gastronomy as a transformative tool, but we need to base this transformative tool on a values-based system. Right? This is very nice when you say it, values-based value chain or values-based food system, but it has to work for all, and that is really a challenge. And I would like to link with Chido here, essentially. Why is it a challenge? It is because if it's a values-based system, it has to be agreed by all. It has to have a very strong bottom-up and top-down approach to be able to have this shared understanding. And I think this is key. It is key because these partnerships enable that some of the perspectives from the producers, from the different stakeholders, from the chef, from the consumer are factored into this. And because of that, it enables making the right choices. It enables raising the right type of awareness, or the awareness that is true. And of course, it enables the excellence which is shared. Let me show you a picture of our second example, which is really about what is happening in one of our projects in Ghana. Now, you see this chocolate bar, which is made out of Ghanaian cocoa. This has been first manufactured in Ghana, which is a very important point. Normally, Ghana exports cocoa beans, and you basically export low value. In this case, we have worked with Ghanaian companies to use Ghana cocoa beans, process it into chocolate bars, and as Chido was saying, support the local market, support the local economy, the regional market, as well as export some value addition. Now, the story here is that when you look at resilience and sustainability, it really starts at the farm. It is much more than the chocolate bar or the way the chocolate bar is produced and the carbon emissions of the chocolate bar itself and the healthy and nutritional values and the taste and so on. It is really about the way in which we are respecting or we are growing this chocolate bar. We are respecting nature. We are growing this chocolate bar. Sorry, the host disabled my screen share. In any case, in these pictures that you saw, we were having the idea of a field that was damaging nature, it was damaging soil, it was about monocropping, cocoa, and that's it. And it was being done with slash and burn, which means burning the soil in order to clear the land and then plant. The other picture, which was all green, it was a lot of biodiversity, several different species of crops, cocoa, trees, was a bit the result. But that was good for the environment, and it's very good as regenerative agriculture in this context, right? It is what they are doing now. But it was not enough, because it is really about understanding, and here goes the point about connection and about making the right choices. What are the priorities or needs of most of these stakeholders, including those that are more marginalized or that are so far away from the supply chain or from the consumer? As Chido was saying, if the farmer doesn't have a living income, he cannot worry about the environment and having this very strong, sustainable system of growing the crops, regenerative agriculture. If the farmer and his family or her family do not have food, and this food not to be purchased, but to be produced, they cannot worry about the environment. So by doing this type of systems with them, the solution came from the farmer groups, from our partners. What we're trying to achieve is targeting sustainability in a very holistic way. The environmental integrity and regenerative agriculture, the living incomes, because these farmers are not only spending less money on food, they are growing what they eat and they're eating what they grow. They are also, of course, selling to the local market and to other markets, other different products apart from cocoa. So there you go. And this is a system in which we've promoted this type of partnerships, but we didn't do it alone. We did it with a network, with the farmer organizations as a means to replicate. And it went all the way down to the consumer, who through the product has the story and has the information about what is being done and why this cocoa is more sustainable than others. And I think we have a very strong link here with the role of the chefs, with the role of gastronomy as a tool to transform the, let's say, livelihoods, the system. If the chefs, if the consumer-facing companies, if the consumers are even more and more interested in what is behind who made my food, how is it done, and so on, then we are succeeding. But we need to communicate, and we need to be researching and very much connected to the right type of information. And I think this is critical. And we can only do that in partnership. We can only do that if we work with the right stakeholders in the different countries. So values-based, it goes beyond the environment, it goes beyond living income. It is really broad, and I think this Congress is tackling a lot of the things that are related to that: food waste, food loss, etc., value addition, etc. Now, I want to also mention another point here in relation to the innovation, the food innovation. I think Matt, and I also, I'm sure, Jose Mari spoke about innovation and research. In the NATMEC context, we are working with the Basque Culinary Center to support the Grenadians and the farmer organizations, and with these farmer organizations we reach thousands, in order to develop different products out of nutmeg. And here is a perfect example of how partnerships that are innovative, that are essentially linking those that are not necessarily talking to each other or connected because of the distance, because of the realities, can result in better income, better trade, better sustainability. With the BCC, we are looking at, and many of the chefs that are partners, we are looking at essentially other products beyond the spice, beyond the maize. We are looking at how to use the pericarp, which is a key thing that is essentially gone to waste otherwise. We are looking how to use the shells. We're looking to do all of this. And the idea, interestingly enough, came from the Grenadians and the farmer organizations in Grenada. How is it that we can work together? Now, our role as ITC was very simple. We are putting them in touch. We are putting the Grenadians together with the BCC and the chefs in touch. And we are ensuring that what we are doing is for development, looking at the different elements of sustainability I was talking before. So with these few examples, I just wanted to thank you all about this Congress, the invitation, and I really wanted to leave you with one important takeaway. Action alone, right? Action as in the gastronomy industry for transformation will not generate long-lasting effort unless we are basing this action on a values-based system, unless we have the right partnerships in place, unless we work together. And on this note, of course, the International Trade Center, the UN at large, is at your disposal to partner and do this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hernan. Muchas gracias. Bom, agora vou passar 2 vídeos para vocês e depois a gente vai seguir com a nossa sequência de palestras. Então, eu vou apresentar um dos temas últimos de hoje. A gente vai falar sobre ativismo. E a gente trouxe uma das vozes aqui do Brasil, nossa parceira, que encerrou o nosso último Fruto 2020, que é a Paloma Costa, com um recado para vocês sobre ativismo, sobre o engajamento dos jovens, principalmente, e depois um outro vídeo do Instituto Socioambiental, que o Alex vai explicar mais para frente. Então, deixo com vocês esses 2 vídeos e a gente, na sequência, volta com mais palestras. Obrigado.
Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Meu nome é Paloma Costa e eu sou ativista da Juventude pelo Clima e vim aqui deixar só um recadinho para vocês. Para mim, falar da juventude, do levante da juventude, é falar da luta pela nossa casa comum. Fruto de um profundo entendimento de uma ecologia social integral, necessário para a continuidade da nossa vida e da nossa existência aqui nessa terra. E se a gente não cuida da nossa terra, não resta nada, nem nós. Cuidar da nossa casa é cuidar das nossas escolhas diárias, individuais, coletivas e políticas. O que você consome? Do que você alimenta seu corpo, sua casa? É agrotóxico ou é orgânico social? Você apoia uma agricultura sustentável que sustenta uma cadeia de valor familiar? Ou tá deixando a boiada passar? Que luta te representa, te sana? A pela vida? Ou esses projetos de morte cujo objetivo é o lucro? Em quem você vota? Em quem você vai votar? Realmente, a mudança ela precisa ser coletiva, com todas as partes e setores envolvidos. Mas, não resta dúvida nenhuma, ela pode e deve começar em você. Então, conto com você. Um abraço.
Você pode falar.
Tá valendo? Não dá para falar de alimento sem pensar na natureza, não dá para pensar no maior elo entre as plantas e o alimento, que são os insetos. Não dá para falar de uma natureza, de um mundo completo, sem falar dos agentes polinizadores, sem falar do mel, sem falar de um cara que eu tenho como uma grande referência na minha vida, e mais legal do que ele ser quase um ídolo para mim, é saber que ele é mais novo do que eu e que as novas gerações vão e podem nos ensinar. Eu queria dar as boas-vindas para o cara que eu me ponho de joelho, o cara que com as suas colmeias trouxe muito conhecimento para mim, para o Dom Restaurante e para toda a equipe do ATA, Jerônimo Vilas Boas.
Muito obrigado pelas palavras, Alex. É um prazer, uma honra estar com vocês aqui nessa tarde. Queria agradecer o Fruto pelo convite, o Basque Culinary Center também. Enfim, fazer um agradecimento especial por todo mundo que está trabalhando na tradução simultânea hoje, porque é um privilégio num evento internacional como esse eu ter a oportunidade de falar minha língua materna, que é o português. Bom, na sessão de hoje, a gente vai falar sobre biodiversidade, E desculpa, eu estou com um probleminha técnico aqui. Vou falar sobre biodiversidade, que é a diversidade da vida, a diversidade dos genes, das bactérias, das plantas, das frutas, enfim, até o coronavírus é biodiversidade. E embora o conceito de biodiversidade, na verdade, a nossa percepção das formas de vida, ela seja tão antiga quanto a própria consciência humana, é relativamente recente esse conceito de biodiversidade. Ele foi mais difundido a partir de 1992, a partir da Convenção da Diversidade Biológica, que foi idealizada numa das conferências das Nações Unidas sobre o meio ambiente, que inclusive aconteceu no Rio de Janeiro. E é interessante a gente pensar que sim, foi só no final do século XX que a gente reconheceu de alguma forma a importância da biodiversidade e incorporamos esse conceito em políticas públicas e acordos internacionais. Mas o que a gente sabe também é que a gente está vivendo uma crise da biodiversidade, que desde a década de 1970 a gente perdeu mais de 60% das espécies existentes no nosso planeta, o que não é surpresa para ninguém. Agora, o que talvez não seja tão claro para todo mundo é o fato de que, até mais acentuada que a própria extinção das espécies, é a extinção do conhecimento que a humanidade tem sobre a natureza. E aqui eu não estou falando de conhecimento científico, eu estou falando de conhecimento empírico, sobre a percepção diária que a gente tem do mundo que está em volta da gente, do nosso quintal e, sobretudo, daquilo que a gente come. O exemplo que o Alex deu hoje sobre o conhecimento das pessoas do que é um pé de laranja é muito simbólico em relação a isso. É claro que o nosso meio de vida urbano e o nosso acesso à tecnologia são causas claras dessa alienação, mas existe um fator mais sutil, existe uma construção cultural que a gente nem se dá conta, que é o conceito de que para proteger a biodiversidade, o homem precisa estar fora dela. Criamos parques nacionais, criamos reservas ecológicas, confinamos a natureza em uma porção de hectares, contemplamos a natureza e a gente não se sente fazendo parte dela. Felizmente, a gente está se dando conta disso. Existem setores da sociedade mobilizados e problematizando essa relação e essa alienação, e um destes setores é a gastronomia. Até por isso que a gente está aqui hoje reunido. E a gastronomia, de fato, é um instrumento poderosíssimo para conectar as pessoas e a natureza. Uma coisa interessante, e que de certa forma está associado com essa nossa alienação, é que no dia a dia da gente que trabalha para buscar ingredientes, viabilizar cadeias de produção, ou seja, de colocar a biodiversidade no mercado, é muito comum ouvir uma pergunta, que é: promover o comércio, o consumo da biodiversidade não ameaça a biodiversidade? E, na verdade, é justamente o oposto. Desde sempre a espécie humana usa a biodiversidade e come a biodiversidade. Por meio das mãos de agricultores, extrativistas, surgiram incontáveis variedades de plantas e raças animais que integram o nosso dia a dia. A biodiversidade, ela não é só da natureza, ela não é só selvagem, ela é também uma construção cultural, uma construção social, inclusive a partir disso que existe e é difundido o conceito daquilo que a gente chama de sociobiodiversidade. Para ilustrar um pouco essas contradições da relação do homem com a natureza, eu gostaria e estou aqui hoje para falar um pouco das abelhas, né? E hoje em dia, se a gente pergunta para alguma pessoa o que vem na cabeça dela quando a gente pensa em abelha, isso pode ser em qualquer lugar do mundo, essa pessoa provavelmente vai falar daquele inseto amarelo e preto dotado de um temível ferrão. Essa é a única abelha que as pessoas conhecem, a abelha do mel, né, cientificamente chamada de Apis mellifera, inclusive no Brasil e nas Américas, onde essa abelha nem sequer é nativa. Antes do processo de colonização das Américas, a abelha do mel não existia aqui. E a grande questão é que, apesar da gente conhecer essa única espécie de abelha, existem mais de 20 mil espécies de abelhas no mundo. Abelhas de todas as formas, cores, tamanhos, e que nem todas produzem mel, nem todas vivem em grandes colônias, mas são todas abelhas. E eu queria destacar um grupo específico entre esse universo enorme de 20 mil espécies de abelhas, que são os meliponíneos, conhecido pela ciência, ou as abelhas sem ferrão. Sim, existem abelhas sem ferrão. Elas são nativas de regiões tropicais e subtropicais da Terra. A grande maioria das espécies está no Brasil, e essas abelhas também produzem mel. Elas produzem mel e elas têm sido criadas por populações tradicionais, povos indígenas, há muito tempo. Né? Cristóvão Colombo, quando chegou nas Américas e descobriu o Novo Mundo, os maias e os astecas já estavam criando abelhas nativas tropicais para a produção de mel e exploração de outros produtos, como pólen. A mesma coisa se aplica aos povos indígenas amazônicos e sul-americanos. E o incrível, e que eu queria falar com vocês, e pena que a gente está no evento virtual para vocês não terem oportunidade de experimentar, é que o mel dessas abelhas é absolutamente incrível. Muito diferente do mel, da abelha do mel ou da Apis mellifera. Ele é um mel menos doce, ele é um mel mais ácido, e ele é um mel que conta com um complexo conjunto de atributos sensoriais oriundos do processo de fermentação que naturalmente acontece dentro das colônias. Se a abelha do mel tradicional desenvolveu a desidratação ou a retirada da água como método de conservação do mel em regiões mais secas, na Europa, ou na África, ou na Ásia, onde elas são nativas, por exemplo, as abelhas nativas do Brasil e de outras regiões tropicais, que vivem num clima totalmente úmido, né, elas desenvolveram outro método de conservação. Não seria evolutivamente eficiente essas abelhas desidratarem o mel num ambiente úmido e onde a tendência da umidade é equilibrar? Então, elas desenvolveram na evolução um outro sistema de conservação do mel, que é a fermentação. Então, quando a gente encontra essas abelhas na natureza e retira o mel na natureza, a gente já encontra esse mel fermentado. O que a gente faz com leite a partir dos queijos ou com o vinho para conservar as uvas, as abelhas já fazem há muito e muito, muito tempo. E arrisco a dizer que elas são, né, uma das inventoras do processo de fermentação dentro dessa lógica que a gente usa de conservação de alimentos. Para conservar o néctar, que é a sua principal fonte de carboidrato, na evolução, as abelhas tropicais desenvolveram sistemas de conservação baseados na fermentação. A questão é que essas abelhas produzem uma quantidade muito pequena de mel, né, e têm sido marginalizadas justamente porque não tem, assim como a Apis mellifera, que é um superorganismo, a capacidade de se colocar no mercado agropecuário como numa posição capaz de atender às expectativas do nosso mercado agrícola, que é baseado na grande escala, na lógica da indústria. Então, esse mel é produzido localmente, por populações locais, e que tem transmitido seus sistemas de produção a várias e várias gerações. E é interessante a gente pensar que em bares e em restaurantes, né, é muito comum a gente ver servir uma salada com mel, ou um pão de mel, ou um drink com mel. Mas de que mel que a gente está falando? De que abelha que a gente está falando? De que flores a gente está falando? Não existe mel, existem méis, é plural. Não existe abelha, existem abelhas, é plural. Né? Mas como vocês sabem também, as abelhas não são importantes só pelo mel, elas desempenham um papel chave na polinização, que é uma das etapas de reprodução das plantas. Essa polinização se aplica tanto em ambientes naturais, mas também nos ecossistemas agrícolas. Para vocês terem uma ideia, a gente tem um dado da FAO que estima que 1/3 da alimentação humana dependa, direta ou indiretamente, da polinização por abelhas. Mas a gente também sabe que as abelhas estão desaparecendo. A cada ano, milhares e milhares de colônias desaparecem, principalmente nos Estados Unidos e na Europa, sendo que a gente observa principalmente essas abelhas Apis mellifera que estão nas caixas. Mas a gente conhece muito pouco o que está acontecendo com as abelhas que estão nos hábitats naturais. A gente está falando da Apis mellifera, mas o que será que está acontecendo com as outras 20 mil espécies? E se a gente pode pensar, bom, primeiro, por que essas abelhas estão desaparecendo? Por conta da forma que a gente produz alimentos. A agricultura a agricultura convencional e a agricultura moderna é o principal fator de desaparecimento das abelhas. A gente tem, primeiro, a expansão das fronteiras agrícolas, que fragmenta a floresta, é o desmatamento, sendo que a floresta e as árvores são o habitat das abelhas, é onde as abelhas vivem. Então, a partir do momento que você implementa largos sistemas de produção agrícola, você está exterminando o habitat delas. Segundo, estamos homogeneizando as paisagens, largas e largas monoculturas que oferecem uma única cultura ou uma única planta na paisagem, sendo que as abelhas elas dependem de um conjunto de plantas e de um conjunto de flores para se nutrir e para ter uma qualidade de vida. A gente pode argumentar, por exemplo, falar grandes cultivos de amêndoa nos Estados Unidos, as abelhas comem flores de amêndoa, ou grandes cultivos de laranja no Brasil, as abelhas se alimentam de laranja, mas a laranjeira e as amendoeiras, elas não florescem ao longo de todo o ano. É necessário que existam outros tipos de planta para compor um conjunto, um ecossistema complexo e diverso, capaz de sustentar a qualidade de vida das abelhas nos ecossistemas agrícolas durante o ano inteiro. E para piorar, em um ambiente agrícola já super pouco favorável por conta da homogeneização, a gente ainda usa indiscriminadamente quantidades absurdas de agrotóxico que efetivamente matam esses insetos. É um sistema absolutamente contraditório, né? A agricultura, que tanto depende das abelhas para polinização e produtividade, não sustenta a existência desses seres que prestam gratuitamente um serviço ambiental e que geram bilhões e bilhões de dólares ou euros anualmente, incrementando em cadeias de alto valor. Falei da amêndoa, mas poderia falar da laranja, do café, da soja e tantas outras culturas que são beneficiadas por ela. Tá? E enquanto a gente não é capaz, como sociedade, de adotar outras alternativas de agricultura capazes de gerar qualidade de vida para as abelhas, fato é que existe um fator, né, de curto prazo que tem retardado a extinção dessas espécies, que é o manejo sustentável das abelhas. A atividade de criação de abelhas tem conservado as abelhas. E os criadores de abelhas não só são guardiões de abelhas, mas eles são guardiões das florestas e de outras plantas de maneira geral, porque a principal matéria-prima do mel, que é o seu produto central, é o néctar que vem das flores. O criador de abelha é um cidadão interessado em conservar formações vegetais. E junto com essas formações vegetais se protegem outras espécies de animais, outras plantas, outros micro-organismos. E para os guardiões de abelhas seguirem desempenhando o seu papel-chave na conservação, é essencial que eles vendam o seu produto. Eles precisam vender mel. E para eles venderem mel, as pessoas precisam comprar mel. E no Brasil, por exemplo, a gente tem um consumo per capita de nem 200 gramas de mel, enquanto na Alemanha se consome mais de 2 quilos de mel por ano e somos o grande produtor de açúcar do planeta Terra. Eu mesmo vivo em uma cidade que é absolutamente rodeada por hectares e hectares de monocultivo de cana. E quando a gente opta por consumir açúcar, e não que o mel cumpra todas as funções do açúcar, a gente está privilegiando um sistema de cultivo em monocultura. Enquanto se a gente aumentasse o nosso consumo de mel, a gente estaria privilegiando um sistema que mantém a floresta de pé. Esse é o caso do mel, mas eu poderia citar outros produtos florestais, por exemplo, né? Cadeias de castanhas, de óleos e pimentas que são desenvolvidas na Amazônia brasileira e em outras regiões do mundo. Poderia citar também sistemas diferentes, como sistemas agroecológicos, sistemas biológicos e orgânicos, que privilegiam matrizes de diversidade ao invés de matrizes de homogeneidade. Então, respondendo àquela pergunta inicial, né, se o consumo de biodiversidade não ameaça a biodiversidade, a conclusão é absolutamente a oposta. Produzir, consumir e vender a bio-homogeneidade é o que ameaça a biodiversidade. É a difusão de um sistema que propaga a homogeneidade que ameaça a diversidade. E aqui, para finalizar, que inclusive eu já passei um pouco do meu tempo, eu gostaria de fazer uma ressalva importante, que eu reconheço que a agricultura moderna e a ciência agronômica convencional conquistaram números super impressionantes na busca para cumprir esse desafio de fato hipercomplexo que é alimentar a humanidade. E questionar esse modelo, de maneira alguma, é desvalorizar os méritos daqueles que o conceberam. E, de alguma forma, esse modelo ele fez sentido por algum tempo, depois da Revolução Industrial, por conta das mudanças que a gente passou no mundo. Mas a Revolução Verde e esse modelo de agricultura, ele é muito recente. Faz pouco mais de meio século que a gente está cultivando alimentos dessa forma. E a gente já tem condições suficientes de constatar que não deu certo. A gente está degradando o nosso solo, a gente está contaminando nossa água, a gente está envenenando nossos filhos. A humanidade é capaz de fazer algo melhor do que isso. Eu acredito muito nisso. A gente tem inteligência suficiente para desenvolver um sistema melhor para alimentar a humanidade. A gente só precisa querer fazer isso. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade de compartilhar algumas palavras e um abraço para todos vocês.
Gracias, Jerónimo, por compartir tu visión sobre la biodiversidad, que va más allá de una riqueza natural, ¿no? Es una riqueza cultural. Y conectando este hilo, me hace tremenda ilusión presentar a nuestro siguiente ponente. Bueno, primero quizá me presento yo. Yo soy Blanca del Noval, líder de una iniciativa que se llama Becunary Lab, en la cual llevamos tiempo trabajando sobre la revalorización de plantas silvestres, ¿no? como recurso natural y también por su valor gastronómico. ¿Y por qué me hace tremenda ilusión presentar a nuestro próximo ponente? Es porque para nosotros, y supongo que para todos los chefs que de alguna manera hemos sido frikis en el tema de plantas silvestres con valor gastronómico, para nosotros ha sido un referente, su libro una Biblia y su trayectoria ha sido una fuente de inspiración. Bueno, sin más, no quiero restarle más tiempo a nuestro ponente, Miles. Hi Miles, it's nice to have you here again, this time quite far, but at the same time,
Hello.
Thanks again for being here.
So I'm not sure. Okay. Should I be seeing, what should I be seeing on the screen? I'm not sure. Okay. All I'm seeing is the title page. Okay, that's a bit disconcerting, but I'll just talk to the title page. Okay. So I guess what I want to talk about really is, it is kind of wildlife and its culture. Just what is wildlife like what is the culture of wildlife or the culture of biodiversity and the biosphere, because I think that actually we don't even need to talk about wildlife, because I spent a lot of time thinking about what does wild mean, and actually I can't really see a distinction between wildness and life. When I look at the quality of what life is, what it means for something to be alive, and then I look at wildness, it seems to me that it's the same thing. What you have is this beautiful dance of many, many things. They're sort of intricately interwoven. They're responding to one another. So there's all these shifts and moves and exchanges happening between so many different diverse elements that creates a whole fabric that then sustains every part and every element within that fabric. Every thread, you might say, is building a support system that undergirds itself. That's life, and that's wildlife. So when we talk about biodiversity, we're I mean, I know there's a section of the topic called biodiversity, which is looking at the crops that have been bred and the varieties of crops. But in the main, when we're talking about biodiversity, we are talking about wild species which have evolved within this complex fabric of life over millions, if not billions of years. And so I think when we're looking at like where things have gone wrong and how we can make things better, my reference point is 100% wildlife and its culture, as it were. The culture, I guess, being all of this intricately woven fabric that sustains everything. So what I guess we'd want to look at is how does that intricately woven fabric get woven? You know, how do many, many, many very diverse and wonderful things get linked up together to create this fabric that keeps the whole thing, sustains it, holds it. But I guess the word, you know, we're talking about the word sustainable. It's a good word to use. You know, that we sustain things, we enable things that are alive to continue to live. You know, and to allow the whole living system to continue to support and undergird each and every species. And so as we're looking at our food system and really as our way of life here in the 21st century for many people in many parts of the world, we're looking at a way of life which is increasingly looking less like what I've just described. Okay, so I've got this statement that I think probably sums up everything that I'm wanting to say, really, which is that life is sustained by immediate contact. So, you know, all of these linkages that we're maybe going to consider, if you look at an ecosystem, a living system of any sort, if you look at your body, the way that your body is sustained is by each cell, each membrane within your body is in vital contact with either ones immediately next to it, or there's transport and communication systems like nerves and your blood flowing through your body that's linking you to every other part in a very immediate way. And so the problem is that when we look at the modern situation we find ourselves in as human beings, what we have is something that is dominated by another system. It's not a living system. And therefore, it doesn't have this immediate contact. We're looking at industry and consumerism, which actually function by a kind of a mediation that removes any kind of immediate contact. Now, it's very interesting to hear the talk by the chap now. You have to forgive me because I've forgotten his name, but the chap from the International Trade Organization, because he was talking about remote links, as it were, between communities producing food and consumers. But it seemed to me that what he was describing there was a way of creating an immediate contact between something that is so remote, like the guys producing the nutmegs, having a way to communicate their story through people that they're actually consuming or using them in a restaurant, able to tell the story to their guests and so on. So there is this scope with kind of global trade of things coming from elsewhere, where we can work at making this immediate contact to make this like a living system. But what is happening by far, the majority of the time, with almost everything we consume these days, and especially within the food system, is that immediate contact is almost entirely severed, and what we have is a very strange situation. And I'm going to try to illustrate that situation through a particular kind of human relationship in a minute. But I guess the point is that if we see that we have ourselves removed from immediate contact by the way that we relate, i.e. by the food that we eat coming from somewhere else, and coming in ways that don't allow us to have any direct, relationship with where it comes from. I mean, it starts with the fact that it doesn't come from here, right? That's the removal of immediate contact first and foremost. But even then, it's coming from faceless, commodified situations, manufacturing and import-export that gives us no insight into the actual story of where this food that we're putting in our mouths originates. So the point is we need to try and restore that contact if we're going to look at sustainability, if we're going to look at our food system becoming a living system. Because I guess what I need to characterize really was when I say life is sustained by immediate contact, industry and consumerism is cutting off that contact by putting all these layers of mediation in between, all these barriers, like a plastic bag that we buy things in is a very good illustration of that. It's putting a barrier, an impenetrable barrier between us and the thing. That we could say is actually characterized as like a machine. So we've got this organism, this organic system, the biosphere, the living systems, the ecosystems that surround us. And then we've got this mechanism, this machine of industrial consumer capitalism. And the point is, our global food system, we have to ask ourselves, is this an organism? Is this an organic system? Is it a living system that's characterized by the characteristics of a living system? Or is it a machine, a mechanism? And I think we can see that clearly in the vast majority of cases. With most of what we consume, we are looking at a machine, we're looking at a mechanism. And that is okay. So what we need to do is restore the contact that has been lost and create a food system that is organic. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to notice that what this mechanism has done, this global industrial machine that is currently producing our food. Okay, so whereas the living system being sustained by immediate contact is basically forging these links, it's forging these little fibers that make the fabric of life. And you could say forging bonds, okay? It's forging bonds like the kind of emotional bonds that we have with other people, with our children, and so on. Those bonds are forged between species and other species, between species and landscape, between people and landscape, between people and other species. And these linkages are the linkages that sustain and support life. So they carry us all, well, when we start looking at machines, what we're looking at is simplifying. We're looking at homogenifying. We're looking at looking for the big yields. We're looking for sort of amassing large storehouses of one thing in one place, instead of what happens in a living system where very intricate little things like blood capillaries or root hairs or the little villi in our gut, the little what are they called? But anyway, the things inside our lungs, the tiny little tubes in our lungs that communicate these little life-sustaining exchanges of food or oxygen or whatever. So the intricately woven pattern of life is totally undermined by these machine systems, which are basically cutting away at the threads. It's like they're snipping away at the net, the fabric, the nest that sustains us. So what we need, obviously, is to get back in touch. We need to restore this living contact. And I guess what I'm going to try and get to in a fairly short space of time is how just learning to recognize and use and forming the habit. I love what Matt said earlier about habits and awareness being so key. So, if we can become aware of the wild plants, for example, that are living and growing very near to where we live. So wherever you are now, I just want you to consider you are somewhere, and that place is a place we might call here. You know, you're in a different here from me, but we're all here, if you see what I mean. And near here, you're here and my here, there are plants growing right now. Just want you to consider that, whether you're in the middle of some metropolis or right out in some rural location that's got good enough internet to tune into this now. You know, there are plants within inches, feet, centimeters, meters, very, very near you. There are plants that you could eat. I just want you to consider that if you didn't already have that as a thought in your mind. And so if you become aware of that, and then you gain the knowledge to recognize and form habits to gather and eat, then this is a situation in which you are restoring an incredible kind of immediate contact with the living systems around you. Because what I want to say is, if you are any other species, there's something very important to note about where your food comes from. And I like to ask this question I'm going to ask now to kids. You know, like talking to kids about foraging, a little gang of kids, and we're outside somewhere, and I ask them, where does your food come from? And some of them will, they never get the answer right, actually. I have to tell you in advance. Nobody ever gives me the answer that I'm actually looking for. Some of them say, oh, from the shop, and others say from the farm, and then others, really smart ones, they say, oh, from the land and the sea, and they think that they must have the answer right. I said, no, you're all wrong. None of those answers are right. What I want to tell you is that food comes from here. It comes from here. Well, you know, I've just spent several minutes discussing the fact that a lot of our food definitely doesn't come from here. But you see, what I'm talking about is what's normal. What is normal if you are a living organism, if you are a species, any other species, but a human being, a Homo sapiens that's caught up in the industrial consumer culture that we're in now, any other species at all, and any other human other than the modern ones that are caught up in this industrial consumer system. Any other species then, apart from this very small minority, the modern human, obtains all of its food from here, from this place here, the place where your body is located. That's where you get your food from. And so we see then it's such an aberration that so many humans are not getting our food from here. We're getting our food from a place called there, somewhere else. And therefore, there's this tremendous barrier between us and where our food comes from, just sheer in terms of distance. Let's see if we can repair that breach and be better informed about where our food comes from when it does come from somewhere else. But look, if we can start getting some of our actual food actually from this actual here, this place where you live, this place where you move around in the course of your daily activities. So I just want to touch on a few things about what does vital or immediate contact mean. You know, what does it mean to have, and what are the means by which we have this vital contact? Well, I've already touched on a couple of them. I was talking about, you know, the fine tubules in your lungs, and these little bits that absorb the food into your blood system, into your capillaries in your gut. These are points of contact, okay? And I just want to say that everything I'm saying could be illustrated through a simple little diagram here. Okay, if you can see that. So we've got skin, okay? And then we've got, on the outside of skin, we've got a place called out, and on the inside of skin, we've got a place called in. Now just think about your body for a moment. So here's a funny thing that somebody pointed out to me a while back. Your skin, if you just follow my skin for a moment, okay, I'm on the outside of me, and then I'll just go inside a little bit, and then, I mean, we're not going to follow this very far, obviously, but in there, my skin carries on to the back of my mouth, down into my throat, into my gut, and sooner or later at the other end, it reemerges. But there's this tube going right through inside me and inside you, and it's infolded. But it's skin that's on the inside, and the same is with your lungs. The same is actually with your ears. You've got eardrums, and on the inside of your eyes, you've got a point of contact called your retina. So these examples with your gut and your lungs, this is a point of contact where you have immediate contact with something. In the case of your lungs, you're breathing in air that comes from here. This is something that we cannot be alienated from. we cannot remove that contact, even though if you're in the city, that's probably not such a good thing. You'd rather be breathing air from somewhere else. But the food that comes into our guts is then digested and has like dissolved particles in the liquid that is then absorbed into your blood capillaries. Well, that is so similar to earlier or other kinds of species. So a plant in the ground has roots and then root hairs, and then all the food and liquid is coming in through those root hairs, which have immediate contact with their surroundings. So we're one step removed because we take the stuff in from our surroundings, and then it comes in through our skin. It comes in through our gut, you know. But the difference is, obviously, we've moved out of this situation where we're just putting things in our mouths that come from here. We're putting things in our mouths that come from somewhere else. But look what happens. If I take that thing, say I go outside right now and I get a dandelion or some other plant, I put it in my mouth, I digest it. Look, what's outside, just outside, I could point outside the door here and see dandelions growing everywhere. And I put them inside my mouth and they digest inside my gut, and the molecules move across the barrier, the skin inside my gut, and into the blood capillaries and move out into parts of my body, and they start building the fabric of my body. So what was outside comes in, and it actually means I've become part of this landscape. So that kind of immediate contact is obvious in terms of eating. But the thing is, the immediate contact in terms of awareness is that we start to see things. It touches the skin at the back of our eyes, you know, that we see what is around us, and we come to kind of notice that. And we work these things into our bodies by eating them. But we work these things into our culture when we do that together. You know, so if more than one person goes out and gathers and eats wild food. So what I want to just try and wrap this up by saying is, like, there's been so much happened around gastronomy with wild foods, and restaurants putting this on the map and making it available to people as, like, this is something like the other person, Chido, said about giving dignity and value to what's locally available. These wild plants being like exalted really to an elevated position, saying this has value, you know. But you see, what we need to have now is, because like the restaurant table is not the center of the global food system. Manufacturers of food are not the center of the global food system. What is the center of our global food system is your table, your kitchen table, your home. So what I want to suggest is, like, let's take all of this wonderful knowledge of gastronomy, but let's now empower ourselves to make meals and food that comes from our immediate surroundings, so that we can restore this immediate contact by eating the wild foods that we have right here.
Thank you so much, Miles. Your talk was amazing. And as always, you led us into your brain, even your body, and you mix our head. And it's always an amazing experience. I hope that everyone keeps the ideas that you just share. And thank you, really. It has been really, really special, your talk. Now we have to move to Barcelona to keep on also talking about perfect designs. We were with Miles hearing about how nature and our bodies and natural ecosystems are so perfectly built. I'm going to change my language into Spanish now, porque, bueno, prefiero hacerlo en mi idioma nativo porque voy a hablar con Elsa, que está en Barcelona. Elsa Iranzo, que va a conectar todo este lío de hoy con temas de food design. ¿Y quién es Elsa? Pues Elsa es la bomba, es diseñadora, creativa, es una mujer inteligentísima, apasionada por temas de la alimentación, y Elsa sabe que la comida no es un fin en sí mismo, ella sabe que la comida es una herramienta, es un medio para conectar a personas con su tiempo y con su espacio, es una herramienta estupenda para interconectarnos. Entonces, sin más, los dejo a todos con Elsa. Bienvenida y gracias por formar parte de esta jornada.
Muchas gracias. Mira, con vuestro permiso voy a compartir pantalla. Si me puedes confirmar, por favor, de que veis la pantalla, te lo agradeceré. ¿Es así?
Sí, ahí estamos.
Perfecto. Vale, pues primeramente muchísimas gracias por invitarme. Estoy súper agradecida de formar parte de esta edición de Fruto. Así que muchas gracias a toda la organización, a los comisarios, al Basque Culinary Center y a Alex y su equipo, que soy fan absoluta. Antes de empezar, debo deciros que soy autodidacta totalmente, que una de mis maneras de aprender es precisamente compartiendo conocimiento, así que gracias. Hoy os voy a hablar de comida y diseño o food design. Bien, como todos sabréis, durante el 2050 la población aumentará y pasará de 7.000 millones a 10.000 millones de personas, y esto requiere muchísimas estrategias y cambios para hacerle frente. Somos todos los responsables, somos los chefs, los diseñadores, sociólogos, consumidores, todos tenemos una gran responsabilidad. Debemos afrontar cambios como la superpoblación, el cambio climático, la escasez de recursos naturales, la sobrealimentación, vendrán nuevas necesidades. Todos debemos afrontar o aportar, mejor dicho, nuevas soluciones, nuevos sistemas, nuevos materiales, nuevos rituales, experiencias y diseñar así un nuevo ecosistema. Para construir este nuevo mundo debemos afrontar cambios de pensamiento, de consciencia, de consumo, pero sobre todo de alimentación. Yo siempre digo que debemos alimentar esta revolución con el diseño. Y el food design nos ayudará a dar soluciones para crear este nuevo paradigma y para crear esta nueva transformación social. Os cuento un poco más sobre mi visión sobre esta conjunción entre food y design. Ya saben que lo que ingerimos trasciende muchísimo más de su valor nutritivo, tiene un impacto en nuestro cuerpo, en nuestra salud, pero también tiene un gran impacto social, cultural y político. Para mí la comida es un potentísimo vehículo para hacer reflexionar, para diseñar y resolver retos futuros de nuestra sociedad y de nuestro planeta. Normalmente cuando hablo o hago trabajar a diseñadores con comida, se lo toman con curiosidad, encuentran la comida como un material de creación como otro, pero es muy curioso porque cuando hablo y trabajo con cocineros o les hablo sobre diseño, normalmente siempre tienen un cierto miedo, tienen un cierto respeto, porque se piensan que los diseñadores o son genios o son gente bastante más superflua, y se piensan que el aporte del diseño a la gastronomía puede ser pues, de hacer la colocación para que los platos sean más atractivos, o escoger un tipo de vajilla, y os voy a demostrar pues, que realmente esto no es así. Quiero explicaros que el diseño viene intrínseco en los seres humanos, que diseño y cocina para mí van de la mano. Como ya sabréis, la cocina es un rasgo distintivo y único de la especie humana. Y cocinar no es un invento moderno, ya hace cientos y miles de millones de años, como también el acto de reunirse alrededor de una mesa. Ese cocinar es fruto de un diseño de supervivencia. Cocinar fue y es diseñar comida, no nos olvidemos, y que tanto cocinar o diseñar comida fue realmente lo que nos hizo humanos. Cuando hablamos de diseño en esos entonces, hablamos también de la creación de los diferentes utensilios o piezas artesanales que se usaban tanto para cultivar, para recolectar, para cocinar. Para mí este es el primer link entre alimento, cocina y diseño. Cuando hablamos de diseño, el diseño quizás es popular, o lo entenderéis, pues para resolver problemas, para sumar valor, para embellecer, pero también sirve para provocar emociones, sirve para cuestionar nuevos valores, para reconfigurar significados, incluso para abrir nuevas posibilidades, incluso os diría para hacerse preguntas. Por lo tanto, los diseñadores, aparte de tomar los alimentos como material de creación y crear cosas tangibles, dícese como la creación del mismo alimento, como la creación de envases, de nuevos utensilios, de nuevos electrodomésticos, también trabajan con cosas intangibles, es decir, es un diseño que puede diseñar nuevas visiones, puede diseñar nuevas ideologías, nuevos sistemas, nuevos procesos, nuevos organismos. Actualmente la comida es considerado, o al menos para mí es considerado material, igual que la pintura, la cerámica o incluso los tejidos. tienen unas propiedades intrínsecas en ellas, como unos colores, unos olores, unas texturas, unas connotaciones antropológicas, históricas, que aplicando diferentes técnicas los podemos hacer más nutritivos, más eficaces, incluso más atractivos. Podemos manipularlos, podemos moldearlos e incluso podemos imprimirlos. Bueno, supongo que hasta ahora os estáis preguntando, bueno, ¿pero qué es esto del food design? Bueno, food design, tal y como dice la palabra, food design es una nueva disciplina de diseño, es una disciplina transversal, holística, multidisciplinar, que involucra diferentes áreas del diseño y de la gastronomía con el objetivo de satisfacer las necesidades humanas. El food design tiene como objetivo mejorar la relación que mantenemos con los humanos. Es cualquier acción o proceso de diseño que va de toda la cadena de la alimentación, que va desde el cultivo de los alimentos, pasando por el transporte, la conservación, el envasado, la comunicación, la comercialización, las nuevas tecnologías, la creación de nuevos utensilios. Va pasando por toda la cadena alimentaria hasta llevar al mismo consumo de los alimentos o a la reutilización de los mismos. Como veis, el food design tiene una infinidad de posibilidades. Durante todo este tiempo he intentado como clasificarlos o hacer como diferentes, hacer como diferentes áreas de donde podemos clasificar todos los, donde podemos aplicar food design. Y bueno, yo he hecho como varias categorías para que entendáis un poco. La primera categoría sería el alimento como el origen de la materia comestible, sería la producción, sería el territorio, el consumo, la ciencia de la cocina, la seguridad alimentaria. Otro para mí importantísimo, en la salud podríamos decir que es nuestra historia como seres humanos, en cómo nos relacionamos con la comida. Serían la gastrofísica, podríamos hablar de neurogastronomía. Otro bloque serían las nuevas tecnologías. Aquí podríamos decir pues, los nuevos materiales, la robótica, el Big Data, la digitalización, nuevas maneras de transportar. Otro bloque para mí sería la sociedad, que sería las tradiciones, la cultura, los comportamientos, las nuevas necesidades, el ocio, la comunicación, el diseño de restaurantes, de nuevos espacios, de cocinas. Y luego habría otro grupo que para mí, ya os digo, es como difícil clasificarlo porque para mí todos se hibridan. Sería como el medio ambiente, que sería como el tema paraguas, y además es el tema, ¿no?, de esta jornada, que para mí sería nuestra conexión o reconexión con la naturaleza, con los animales, la biodiversidad, el medio ambiente, el cambio climático, los recursos naturales y la gestión de los residuos. Para mí, los orígenes del food design, como os he dicho antes, quizás es este diseño de supervivencia que os contaba antes, ¿no?, de la creación que nuestros antepasados hicieron para poder recolectar, cultivar, al final comer. Pero os explico ejemplos que para mí quizás no tienen la etiqueta de food design, pero para mí es food design, ¿no? En el momento que en un caramelo se le coloca un palo para que los niños no se ensucien las manos, esto es food design. De otra manera, quizás un poco más consciente, encontramos ejemplos en la historia y que quizás aquí ya se empezó como a utilizar esta terminología. Fue, por ejemplo, los nuevos diseños de pasta, por ejemplo, de Marilé, en este caso en el 83, Proyecto Giurano, que es un nuevo diseño de pasta ya súper estudiado, que al final es que ese diseño sirve para una mejor incorporación, por ejemplo, de la salsa en la misma pasta. Ahora os voy a poner como varios ejemplos para que veáis qué entiendo yo por food design, y además son unos ejemplos que creo que también dicen mucho de la curaduría y del comisariado que hago de muchos proyectos de food design y de food art. Uno, por ejemplo, sería el diseño de un nuevo huevo. Es de una diseñadora llamada Anna Larkins. Ella ha creado un huevo de origen vegetal, conservando o intentando conservar o mejorar el sabor, los colores, la textura de un huevo convencional. En este caso es un huevo sin gallina, pero que además ella ha hecho un reto que es incorporarle o intentar hacer unos huevos con unas formas cúbicas, con diferentes formas acilindradas, formas que son biológicamente imposibles de producir por una gallina. Encontramos otros ejemplos que también yo creo que son importantes y que van a cambiar o están cambiando la tipología en cómo estamos viviendo y en cómo nos relacionamos, en este caso con nuestros espacios. Este es un proyecto que es una microgranja de algas, que bueno, no hace falta decir pues, que es el alimento ideal para la humanidad por su alto contenido nutricional, pero qué cambio de paradigma que en nuestras casas ya podamos, ya formen parte de nuestra decoración o de nuestra vida o de nuestros rituales diarios, que es poder cultivar estas algas. Otros proyectos también interesantísimos y al igual que hablo de las algas también podemos hablar de los insectos, ¿no? Hay gente que ya está visualizando este futuro o este presente, diseñando, por ejemplo, nuevos utensilios para poder comer estos insectos. O nuevos materiales. Cada día leo nuevos estudios, nuevos diseñadores que están sacando al mercado o están probando nuevos materiales. En este caso es un biomaterial hecho por la diseñadora Holly Grounds. Es un material hecho con fécula de patata con agua y glicerina. Es un nuevo, también sería una nueva tipología de empaques. Podemos prescindir de un plástico para envolver nuestros alimentos. Un bioplástico que sirve para proteger estos fideos, pero que a la vez, cuando son sumergidos en el agua, forma parte de la comida y aparte puede contener otros ingredientes que pueden favorecer a los fideos. Encontramos otras tipologías que para mí son interesantísimas, que es esta co-creación, es esta colaboración entre los humanos y nuestros alimentos, en este caso como las algas. Esta es una instalación producida por Eat Art Collective, donde el visitante forma parte del ciclo de la vida de las algas. En este caso, los visitantes, como veis, se pueden sentar en la parte inferior. Aportan a las algas un dióxido de carbono y a la vez las algas recompensan al visitante pues que al final de este rato que comparten y co-crean dan un batido de cóctel de algas. O incluso, os pondría muchísimos ejemplos, pero un poco también orientado al mundo de la restauración. No sé si sabréis que el restaurante de Can Roca tiene un proyecto que se llama Roca Recicla, que precisamente junto con el diseñador Andreu Carulla tienen un reto en común, que el reto es encontrar fórmulas para reutilizar los materiales no reciclables. En este caso es un proyecto que se llama RR201, consiste en darle una segunda vida a estas cajas que transportan los alimentos, estas cajas de un poliestireno, poliestireno expandido, le dan una segunda vida y al final crean un nuevo producto, en este caso un taburete que se pueden comprar en el mismo restaurante. Bueno, llegados aquí os contaría muchos proyectos, pero he intentado sintetizarlos por el tiempo que tengo, pero ahora sí que me gustaría presentarme. Soy Elsa Iranzo, como bien habéis dicho, soy de Barcelona, soy diseñadora, directora de arte, comisaria. Actualmente dirijo mi estudio de Food Design aquí en Barcelona. Mi experiencia en estos últimos años ha sido en diseñar y producir diferentes instalaciones artísticas y sensoriales con comida. He trabajado y trabajo para marcas, para festivales, para museos, instituciones, galerías de arte, con el objetivo de transformar, de inspirar, de hacer reflexionar, divulgar y generar nuevos vínculos entre las personas y la comida, siempre a través del arte, del diseño y de la belleza. Autoproduzco proyectos artísticos relacionando también siempre arte, comida y diseño, siempre con una finalidad divulgativa. Soy docente en diferentes universidades de Barcelona, tanto de diseño como de gastronomía, así que también doy mucho hincapié que yo creo que lo importantísimo aquí es la docencia y esta visión más holística y más transversal y más multidisciplinar que os contaba al principio. Y ahora estoy feliz porque acabo de abrir un nuevo espacio online, en este caso se llama The Art and Design Food Academy, Se trata de un nuevo espacio de aprendizaje online, de inspiración, de conocimiento, con el objetivo igual de transformar y de generar nuevos vínculos entre la comida y las personas a través del food art y del food design. El objetivo es que cada uno, a través de estas cápsulas de conocimiento que digo yo, pueda identificar, pueda visualizar, pueda adelantarse a las necesidades y a las tendencias del futuro y generar nuevas oportunidades y crear nuevos ámbitos de actuación e interacción con la comida. Espero que os haya quedado claro la necesidad del food design. Así que yo creo que, como han dicho todos mis compañeros panelistas, yo creo que esto es una llamada a la acción. Ahora más que nunca debemos usar nuestros conocimientos, nuestra visión, nuestra sensibilidad para replantear el futuro de la alimentación y generar un nuevo movimiento, estoy convencidísima, un nuevo movimiento que a través del diseño, del arte y de la innovación podemos inspirar, podemos aportar y reconvertir el futuro del food. Yo creo que ahora más que nunca necesitamos personas y proyectos con propósito. Todos tenemos la capacidad creativa, importantísimo, capacidad creativa de cambiar y de diseñar nuevos futuros. Yo creo que debemos ser mucho más creativos para ser más sostenibles y sin duda que el diseño puede cambiar la forma en que nos relacionamos con la comida y debe ser así. Así que uno de mis objetivos es democratizar esta disciplina del food design y voy a acabar aquí con Food Design for Now, Food Design for All. Así que muchísimas gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias, Elsa. Muchas gracias por compartir con nosotros, estar acá y presentar tus ideas, tus promociones y tus conceptos de food design. Me encanta un montón y te agradezco de estar aquí y compartir con nosotros. Now I'm going to change to English and I'm going to present the next theme. We're going to talk about circular economy. If you didn't heard about it, soon you will. For that, we have Gaël Legillard from Ellen MacArthur Foundation to explain to us more about this concept of circular economy, also their projects and actions that is developing too. So please welcome Gaël, all yours. Thank you so much to have you here.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can make this work. Oh, yeah. All right, so I'm really happy to be speaking after Elsa, actually, because food design is a big part of my work in a different way. And she ignited your creator brain, so I will ask you to continue using them. Let's imagine for a second. What if your food could build biodiversity? What if we used every part of the fruit, from the stem to the seeds? What if your food could improve the field it's been grown into? Unfortunately, it's not the case today. Today's food system is on a global level a take, make, waste system. And it's not just food, it's our entire economy that is linear. We take resources out of the ground, we make a product, often for quite a short use, and then we dispose it. It's a very wasteful system. And it depends on finite resources. It's usually polluting, damages the health of the ecosystem and nature. And food is a pretty iconic example of a linear industry. We extract vast amounts of finite resources to grow and make the food that we eat. And a tiny fraction that you can see, this tiny arrow that goes down, that's less than 2%, is being collected and treated in a valuable way. And as a result, we can see around the world our soil degrading. The world has roughly 60 harvests left. I mean, 60 more years of food before our soil quality is diminished to a point of no return. At the same time, we have nitrogen running off from mismanaged fertilizers and manure, and it's having terrible effects on the waterways. And on top of that, we let valuable food and valuable byproducts go to waste. So it's pretty clear that we need a fundamental redesign of the system. The problem is making tweaks to the current linear system is not enough. Intending to do a bit less harm is about trying to make it more efficient. So it turned this big, fat, linear arrow into pretty much a thinner arrow, which is good in itself, but still fundamentally linear. And it's simply not working for the long term. So what we need is a circular economy. And the circular economy is a system that is fit for the 21st century and beyond. Circular economy rests on three main principles. The first one is around waste and pollution being eliminated by design. The second one is that all materials are kept in the economy, maintaining their value and quality as much as possible. And the last one is where natural systems are regenerated rather than degraded. So we live it better than we found it. And this is what the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is all about. Everything we do is underpinned by those three principles. Everything we do is about accelerating the transition to a circular economy. And what we're doing now is we're igniting a food system transformation with the Food Initiative. In order to change a global system, we need a completely new approach. And where the entire value chain, all the actors in the system gather in one room and collaborate. And that's why we have gathered all those partners on our journey in the Food Initiative. It will take action from all of us in this call, from all the amazing speakers that you've heard before, and each and every one of you that is listening across the food system. But the good news, and there are a lot of good news, is that there are examples already out there. Change is already underway, we can see it. And so what does great look like? We have an amazing snapshot thanks to a project called Connect the Dots. It's a program run by the municipality of São Paulo in Brazil. And this program supports farmers around the region to transition to agroecological farming practices. So that leads to the production of very high quality local food, which supports natural systems, builds soil health, promotes biodiversity, and helps to tackle climate change. What this program also does is that it transforms urban organic waste streams into organic fertilizers. So for example, since 2015, the pilot facility in Lapa has received 5 tons of organic waste daily, so every day, 5 tons, from all 26 markets within this borough. And the resulting fertilizer is very valuable and has been donated to the local farmers that we were talking about earlier. And finally, the program, through the municipality, provides 2 million meals a day to students in the school system. And for many vulnerable children, this is their main meal of the day. So we can really see with that example that if we connect together, if we connect all the different actors, we can achieve a lot more actually than if we were all working in isolation. So let's go back to the 3 ambitions of a circular food system. That's this example is illustrated really well. So the first one is we need food that is grown in a way that improves ecosystem and human health instead of damaging them. Second, we need to make sure that we're not wasting or losing food along the value chain. In circular economy, we don't see waste. We see inputs for new cycle. And for food is no different. Byproducts can be used to make new food products or be transformed into animal feed or compost, or as a last resort, bioenergy or new material. And that's where we're back to design that Elsa was talking about. And that's, I think, where a lot of you that are listening come in, is like any consumer product, food products are designed. And whether, by a chef in your favorite restaurant, or by a product developer in a big food company, or by Elsa herself. And for us at the foundation, food design is everything that happens between the moment where a raw ingredient is harvested to when it ends up on our plate. So everything that happens in between is food design. So for example, a chef creating a new recipe is food design. A nutritionist deciding on new menus for the school year, that's food design. Buyers choosing how they will source the ingredients, that's food design as well. All of those decisions, they influence what is possible to do further downstream, the byproducts that are generated, and at the same time, they incentivize suppliers upstream by creating demand. So for example, if the demand for food grown regeneratively increases, farmers will be incentivized to switch to those practices. So what does great look like here in the food design space? So an amazing restaurant is Nola. And it's a funny story because it's linked to one of the speakers, Matt, that spoke earlier. So after learning from him that European restaurants produce on average 70,000 kilograms of waste per year, 3 chefs, 3 friends, they decided to open a restaurant called Nola, which means zero in Finnish, because it's a zero waste restaurant. And already within 2 weeks of opening, they had reduced their waste by 80%. The ingredients are procured from local producers. There are no single-use packaging that enters the restaurant premises. There are no bins. The food waste is directly put into composting machines. And this soil material is returned to the suppliers. So we have a great loop. And their zero waste philosophy does not only apply to food, it also applies to their interiors, their glassware, the napkins. Everything has been really carefully selected because they're made from reused or recycled material. So for example, the chairs are made from wood offcuts from the exhibition industry. The cooking oil is delivered in 200-liter reusable containers. Another great example is something called Café Bueno. So coffee is actually one of the most consumed plants on Earth, and yet we have historically underutilized it. So Café Bueno is a company in Copenhagen, and they utilize coffee byproducts, such as spent coffee grounds that you get after you've made coffee, from hotels, offices, and they transform those coffee grounds into ingredients, so like oil for cosmetics, exfoliants, gluten-free flour, and all of these ingredients go then back into those hotels and offices through products. So what can you do as part of this food design stage? It doesn't have to be complicated. There are many resources you can start with, including our report that we launched last year. We also have aired an amazing webinar called the Big Food Workshop that you can still see on our website. And then there's also Advance London, who has published a restaurant guide for the circular economy. It's called Food That Doesn't Cost the Earth. It has a lot of very practical advice and recommendation. Another thing you can do is change your relationships. So we really believe, and I was really happy to see and to hear many speakers before me that emphasize this point, that change will come through relationships. If you are invested in your supplier's interest and they are invested in yours, you will quickly realize a wealth of opportunities that you can create together. And another thing, another advice is that, as I said earlier, waste doesn't exist in nature. So someone that I interviewed a couple of weeks ago told me a story. He was asking chefs, like, when does food become waste? And the answer was like, well, I guess when it reaches the bin. So he challenged them back, and he was like, so how can we make sure it never reaches the bin? And that's my question to you. How can you make sure food never reaches the bin? Because everything has value. Another great thing to start doing is thinking differently. Don't think I need this ingredient, but instead think I want this texture, I want this flavor, I want this color. A great example is NotCo. They've used an AI platform, and they call the algorithm Giuseppe, which I think is really funny. And they used it to create a recipe for a mayonnaise called Not Mayo, which tastes like mayonnaise but replaces eggs with plant-based ingredients. So, for example, this AI algorithm has found out that if you combine a broccoli with a goji, a mushroom, and a nut, that gives you the flavor of chocolate. So thinking differently. And lastly, I want to leave you with one thought from Mokadi Itswang, which is a fantastic South African chef. She's the executive chef at Lotcha in South Africa. And she gave us an advice during our big food workshop that really, really stuck with me. And I wanted to share it with you. When asked how we all could promote biodiversity and use indigenous ingredients, she answered, ask your grandmother. Ask her what ingredients she cooked. And that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much. Now I want to present Camille Etienne. It's a young activist from Onepret, collective from environmental in France. So it's been a huge pleasure to present you all Camille Etienne, please.
Kind of an online event situation, but we are okay, and we are happy to see Camille, that she's already online. So happy to see you, Camille. Welcome.
Hey, so sorry. I think it's the mountain connection, but now here I am, and it works. I'm so happy to see you.
This is the good part of an online event, because it's real. Everything is happening as you're seeing it, so it's perfect. So as Felipe was saying, well, Camille is an inspiring and strong young voice right now, and she has been fighting for the change that we normally dream about, but she fights for it, and she not only dreams, but she chase her ideas, and it's amazing to have her with us. We hope she can inspire all the young people that it's part of Basque Culinary Center and all the people that is connected with us right now. And I won't take more time. I just want to hear you and be also inspired. Thank you so much, Camille.
Thank you so much for receiving me here in Spain. That's pretty far from where I live, actually. And thanks to social media now, we can connect with everyone. I will be quite quick. Just telling you, it's really weird for me to speak in English, telling this. I'm used to do conferences in French. But, to tell you, why did I start all this? Just one thing first, is that it's not a choice. I mean, like, if you take the time to realize what is happening, to realize the emergency we're in, talking about climate, talking about biodiversity and all this, then you have to act. It's just something that you feel in your belly. And if you do not do it, then you're like, I can't even imagine. It's just like, I have hope, and I am someone hopeful because I am into action, and it's the thing I could recommend to everyone. Since you start acting, then you really start being hopeful. So yeah, hope comes from action, so just join us. Now to tell you something, two little things I wanted to tell you, very important for me, is that, let's say three. The first one is that there is no one way to become an activist. Otherwise, if we would have only 10 points telling us how to save the world, we would already have done this. I mean, it's way harder than this, but at the same time, it's way more exciting because everyone can be part of it, whether it is, like you were talking about food, whether it is being a farmer, an engaged farmer, whether it is to be a cooker, a singer, anything you want, anything you like, just find the reason why you wake up in the morning and use it, and use your energy to start walking on the right way. The second thing, very important for me, is that it's not an hobby. We are not only fighting for animals. We are not only fighting for polar bear. It's not something that we like, it's just about us. We are nature. And if nature disappears, we are disappearing as well. We forgot as humans that we are part of it. We are not just against it. We act as if we are against because we are scared, but actually because we don't know it's nature. But actually we are part of it, and we are the one in danger. Here in France, every single year, 60,000 people die because of air pollution. That's a lot. That's way more than COVID. COVID-19 pandemic. So actually, it's happening now. It's not something that we are going to talk for future generation or even my future. It's now. It's happening now. People are dying now. People are suffering now. It's not only about nature. It's about us as well. So this is very important. This is quite sad, I know. But the good thing, and now I will move to the good news, is that we can do something. Like science is projection. Science is telling us simply, okay, people, if you keep acting like this, this is what's going to happen. They can just say this. They can just do modeling, they put the numbers on the computers, they are taking draft, they are taking some temperature and so on. And then they're just telling you, okay, if you're doing this, this is going to happen. But it depends on us. I mean, we can change this. We can decide that which road we want to take, and then everything could be way more beautiful than now. The last thing very important for me is that what I'm talking a lot about hope. For climate is quite different. Talking about climate, actually the CO2 has a certain life in the air, and even if we stop producing everything now, starting today, we will still have a melting glacier. We will still have burning a forest and so on, because what we emit, the CO2 we put in the air today, will live for quite a long time. So this is pretty sad. But the good news is that there is biodiversity as well. And talking about biodiversity, something that we forgot is that life is super resilient. Nature is super resilient. If we start putting a beach, or a forest, or I don't know, like a crop to stay in the area of agriculture, the topics you're really talking about today, this afternoon. If you start using more natural stuff and stop using pesticides and herbicides, then you will see very, very quickly that the life is going back in the crop. So we can do something. Nature is resilient. So we have the power to make it better. So I feel that I'm part of a weird generation. To talk to you about what I'm doing in life, what is to be an activist, a 20 years old activist today. I know it's really weird, but we are trying to organize on each other. We are going in the street, we're protesting, we are doing all this stuff. We are also doing some lobbying to the European Commission. We are doing lobbying to the local deputy, to the CEO of the big group and companies. So all of this is exhausting. And we did not really choose this. I mean, we have to do it. It's just we have a world that the other generation gave us, and this is the huge challenge of our time. But at the same time, it is pretty exciting, to be part of the heroes that actually save the world, because this is exactly just what is happening. It's less sexy than in Hollywood movie, but it's still the same. I mean, we can be the one that decided that we put the history and we rewrite it and we choose another road. So just join us and let's be part of it all together. We need everyone in this fight.
So Camila, I wanted to ask you, if I wanted to start just connecting with this whole movement, what should be my first step?
I think the first step is the one I told you, is like asking yourself a question first. What are you good at? If it's being a journalist, then still do this. I mean, we need involved journalists. We need media to talk more about this. If it's being a farmer because you like putting your hand in the soil and producing food, do it. Just start your farms. So really just do whatever you like, whatever you're good at, but do it for the good reason. Just find back the reason why we're doing stuff and start opening our mind and opening our eyes and being less lazy, I would say. But more concretely, if you want to join like the youth movement and so on, there is a lot of local group as Greenpeace. That is in every single country. You get a Greenpeace group, a Youth for Climate, Extinction Rebellion. There's many of things, but just, please just ask yourself this question. This is very crucial.
Are you sure your generation knows how to break this laziness that you're talking about? Are you the best generation to change the speed of this revolution that we are needing? How do you see yourself in the new generation? How is people today, like young people? How do you see your own generation?
I get that we have no choice. We are living a super weird world. Every single generation had its own challenges. I mean, for our grandfather, it might be war, it might be they had hard time as well. I mean, I don't want to say that we are the one that that is living the hardest life. It's not true. Every single generation has to deal with history at some point, but today, our generation had to deal with something really weird because we can't really see, the consequences in front of us. It's not as a war. The enemy is more, is more weird. The consequences is there. We just need to open our eyes and start acting, because every single day of more laziness is every single day of inaction, and is the consequences that will be bigger. So just start opening it.
Thank you, Camille. It has been a pleasure. I hope to see you here next time. Felipe, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Gracias, Sasha. Perdón por algo aquí de tecnología, pero vamos.
Real life emotion.
Now, real life, digital life in real life. So now I'm gonna present, and we have such an honor to have here with us the British author, architect, and author of Zootopia, the last book that he launched this year, 2020. It's such a pleasure to have Caroline Steele with us to talk about sustainability, city, and please rethinking the relationship between what, where, and how we eat. So please, Caroline Steele, thank you very much to be with us today.
Many thanks, Felipe, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I would like to share with you basically the way we can save the world through food, as I say in my book, which you can see here, which came out basically in March, the same week as the global pandemic was declared. Now I just have to work out how to make the slides go forward, which I actually have no idea how to do. Oh, maybe down there. Yes. So Zootopia is a word that I made up about 15 years ago. It means food place. As you can see here, it's from the Greek zotos for food and topos for place. And I made this word up because I discovered that the word utopia, which is of course our greatest tradition of thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live, actually turns out not to exist, because it's a good place but no place. And I remember finding that very depressing. But I thought, well, we live in a world shaped by food. I should say I had just spent the last 7 years researching my previous book, Hungry City, basically looking at the way cities are fed. And I realized that basically we live in a food-shaped world. And, food could basically represent an alternative way of shaping the world for us, because in a sense, we wouldn't exist without it. Our landscapes are shaped by it, our cities, and of course politics and economics as well. And I mean, this is actually my favorite image to describe really the sort of the food-shaped world that we live in. This wonderful fresco of Ambrogio Lorenzetti's, painted in the 14th century, which is at a time really when, a rare moment, I would say, when in our history, political leaders have really understood the importance of balancing the city and the countryside. And it's a wonderful image, but a very unusual one, because I actually don't know any other image anywhere that shows this relationship. And it's very interesting that this fresco sits in the town hall in Siena, and that it's called the Allegory of the Effects of Good Government. So basically, there have been moments in history when political leaders have understood the importance of this fundamental relationship. But of course, most of the time we don't see this. And, you know, I mean, today I'm having trouble with this slide control thing. I just try and go back, I hope, yes. Of course, today we don't look out of our windows and see the landscape that feeds us. It's often thousands of miles away. This is my hometown of London. The landscape that feeds many of my fellow Londoners is often thousands of miles away and also heavily denatured, as is this image of the Mato Grosso in Brazil. And of course, as we've already been hearing, you know, we're facing a global catastrophe, and the way we eat has a large amount to do with it. I call this the urban paradox, because we think of ourselves as living in cities, but actually, as the impact of the way we eat becomes more and more evident, it's clear that we haven't really solved the most ancient problem of human civilization, which is the slide I was sort of showing you earlier by mistake, the question of how to eat. It's the shared question around which we evolved as a species. We evolved technologies to get better and better at this, and through the discovery of the control of fire, which was really a game changer for us, it's the beginning of home, but it's also the beginning of a kind of sharing, which is fundamental. I often say the shared meal eaten around the campfire is the oldest and best economy ever invented. So through history, you know, over the last 15,000 years or something like that, we've gone from being hunter-gatherers, which most humans were in history, through, as I say, the adoption of more and more sophisticated technologies to solve this problem of how to eat. So we discovered farming and ploughing and all the rest of it. And then about 250 years ago, started discovering that we could use fossil fuels. And of course, you know, we know where this has led. So as we've employed different technologies to feed ourselves, we've also lived differently. So I think it's difficult to overstate how much, as I say, food shapes our lives in ways that we don't necessarily understand. So the tradition, you know, the transition from living in the larder, as I call it, which is represented by this picture on the left, to living on farms, and now, of course, living in cities, is all to do with the fact that we've evolved the way we feed ourselves. Although, as I say, we don't really live in cities because our food still comes from the countryside. So that is the urban paradox. Of course, as home has changed because of the way we feed ourselves changing, what we kind of do all day has changed as well. So we've gone from more or less spending our entire day sort of somehow involved in just keeping the whole thing going. I mean, it's very interesting to me that most hunter-gatherer societies don't have the word work or the concept of work, because basically they're kind of working all the time, although interestingly not very hard, indeed not nearly as hard as early farmers did who came along after them, which is why farming is often portrayed as a punishment in creation myths. So we've gone from this kind of living in the larder, as I call it, to a very crafts-based world. Now, of course, to a very technological world where most of us sort of spend our time sitting at a desk staring at a screen, never more so than under COVID. And we think of this as progress. But actually, of course, now we're facing all of these massive questions about where is this going? You know, and as we know, robots are taking over our jobs, and we ourselves are becoming dehumanized because we're not using our bodies anymore. We're turning into these kind of fat, useless blobs. I mean, this is, sorry, a wonderful image from the film Wall-E, where we've trashed the planet and basically we're floating around in space. this is where, ironically, our current idea of a good life is leading us. And it's based on this fabrication of a thing called cheap food, which actually doesn't exist. It's only being created by externalizing its true costs. Many of which you're familiar with, I'm sure, but, degraded farmland, greenhouse gas emissions, the use of water, and so on. And of course, crucially now, we have a mass extinction and climate change, really sort of presenting us with unprecedented global threats. The world is also turning into a kind of basically a recipient of the kind of highly processed industrial food which is causing this transition, partly because there's a lot of embedded power in this sort of food, and also partly because most of us can't resist it because it's full of salt, sugar, and fat, which our hunter-gatherer brains are unable to resist. So we're facing a global crisis, and of course COVID itself has kind of highlighted many of the fragilities of the way we now eat. Of course, it's to do with the lack of biodiversity and our encroachment on the wilderness. So basically our relationship with nature being heavily out of kilter. Now it's time for a rethink, obviously. And for me, there's no more interesting way than sort of phrasing that, the question that we really need to ask, but this wonderful quote from Cedric Price, British architect. He said, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think, as I say, we've literally evolved through the invention of new technologies that have allowed us to live in a particular way. But as we've evolved those technologies, what we've forgotten is what we leave behind, or the additional problems that we create in living in a particular way. So we need a rethink. And so what was the question? Well, what I find really interesting is that the question hasn't really changed for at least 5,000 years. So that Lorenzetti image, where the allegory of good government was to balance city and nature, is really a tradition that goes all the way through urban history. The Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, were sort of really wondering how they could keep the city going and wanted to keep the city small. Thomas More did the same with his Utopia. Ebenezer Howard is arguing for the same, a kind of return to the city state, where city and countryside live in perfect balance with each other. And of course, that is why, as I explained at the beginning, I invented the word Sitopia, because I think many of the questions that utopians ask can be asked through food, and in fact are always have to be asked through food. It's just that food was never really that visible to people, because I often say it's too big to see. It shapes everything in our world, so it can be difficult to see it. But if we do see it, it's an incredibly powerful force for change. Very obviously, it's a flow going through our world, shaping it how it goes. So it goes from the landscape to kind of distribution centers, a market or a supermarket in the city, a kitchen, then we eat it, it passes through our bodies, then it goes through the waste system and back again. But of course, this is a very complex system because every stage is affecting and affected by every other stage. So really you could call this culture or society or life. And the thing is, at every stage of that journey, we have choices. Do we let cows eat grass, which is, what they evolved to do? They're ruminants, which is why we co-evolved with them, because we can't eat grass, we can drink milk and eat beef. Or do we feed them full of grain in these huge animal feeding operations and pump them full of antibiotics? Do we go to the center of a city and meet another human when we buy food? Or do we leave the city in the name of efficiency? Or do we just dial up a curry on our phones? Do we take time to eat together? Or, as under just before lockdown, the statistic was 1 in 5 meals in America were being eaten in a car. And the question, of course, is which of these solutions to feeding ourselves actually gives us a good life, actually makes us happy, and actually allows us to balance the two most key relationships in our lives, which is between us and one another, and between us as a species and the natural world. I think it's very ironic that the times in history when we've really valued food have been during a crisis. So this is London in the Second World War, Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, Detroit after the cars left. And people immediately started growing food again. Food networks sprang up because there was a crisis, and the importance of food became very obvious, as indeed it has done under COVID as well. Sorry, I thought I'd hit the slide thing, but I haven't. Or it's got stuck or something. So I think, you know, the key takeaway in essence, okay, it's doing weird things. The key takeaway is that, you know, we have to work with nature. There's no choice. I mean, we have to stop farming with chemicals. I mean, the good news is that there are incredible ideas for how to do this out there. Some of them are thousands of years old. The Chinese, for example, have been farming permaculturally for 5,000 years. They kind of stopped recently, but you know, we have the know-how, mimicking the forest. Clearly working with a living soil is essential, and you know, the idea of interrogating nature and asking it what it wants to feed us rather than imposing our idea of what we eat onto it. So there's very exciting things happening in regenerative agriculture. I think we have to become more engaged politically with food and stop just being passive recipients of it. But again, there's many, many examples of how to be what Carlo Petrini, the founder of Slow Food, calls a co-producer, from joining a food co-op or a community-supported agriculture farm where you pay the farm in advance to feed you, maybe work on the farm with him, organic box schemes, growing food in the city, guerrilla gardening, and so on. So we're entering a neo-geographical age when we really have to think about geography again, which is why it makes a lot of sense to move to a more localized, more regional way of living. And I think we need to embed food right in the center of our minds when we rethink this world. Of course, this can involve growing food in cities on a big scale, embedding food in politics, making space for things like markets, obviously preserving the rural infrastructure that allows regenerative farming to take place, which, by the way, is very sort of variegated and involves animals, creating food hubs in the city like this wonderful one in Antwerp, Pact, and of course vertical farming, although its impact is probably limited to fruit and vegetables basically. And then I come back in a sense to the Lorenzetti again. You know, there are many ways we can recalibrate the relationship between the city and the countryside. We can do it with the evolution of cities, and you know, this is 100 years old, this idea. I mean, as I say, this is an ancient idea that we balance city and country. You know, you preserve the countryside so the city expands in a star shape, or you post-fit the city with productive land, as Bern and Viljoen are sort of suggesting, continuative, productive urban landscapes, which is basically bringing farms back to the city, interrogating the local hinterland and seeing what it can grow, as in this study in New York, or incorporating food in our designs for future cities, as MVRDV are doing in the Netherlands in Almere. This is my metaphor for a good society. Basically, a good society is one in which everyone eats well. We're very, very good at sharing through food. That's how we evolved as a species. And I think we need to re-embed the value in food. And by that, I do mean internalize the true cost of food, which, by the way, makes industrial livestock production unaffordable. But then you need, obviously, land reform, wealth redistribution, and so on, so everyone can afford to eat well. But that's the goal. That's where we need to get to, I believe. I think food is an amazingly powerful multidisciplinary tool with which we can address a huge range of all the major problems we face at the moment can be addressed through the lens of food. And that's really the big idea of Sitopia, is that we use it, we stick our pineapple-shaped glasses on, and we can save the world through food. And in fact, we can't save the world without revaluing food. So that's what I hope we can do together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. It was a pleasure. When I grow up, I want to be just 1% as intelligent as you are. I've been so lucky to have you in this event. I'm a fan, total fan. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are about to close this conference, and I'm happy to have you all here, taking the place in this last moment. I don't want to say anything more than leave Alex and Felipe to say goodbye. y me paso al español porque luego de que escuchemos a Alex y a Felipe, los alumnos de Basque Culinary Center tienen un mensaje especial para compartir con ustedes a modo de cierre. Y pues nada más que compartir la emoción que ha sido interconectarnos desde dos rincones tan remotos y estar tan lejos pero a la vez tan cerca en tiempos que son difíciles, que son locos pero ilusionantes, y celebrar la complicidad y la alegría y la amistad que ha habido con este grupo lindísimo que hemos formado de BCC y de Fruto, que el próximo lo vamos a hacer en Brasil, ya hemos dicho.
Y ahí también, o sea, van a tener muchos próximos. Muchas gracias, agradezco a todos desde Basque e daqui, agora passo a português. Queria agradecer a todos que acompanharam esse dia de hoje, dizer que amanhã ainda tem mais um pouquinho, então que continuem conectados com a gente e que esses diálogos vão continuar. Enquanto isso, a gente também tem todos os nossos diálogos, como a Alex já falou, traduzidos e com legenda nas nossas redes sociais, então pode acompanhar por ali, mas amanhã tem mais ainda para a gente acompanhar. Alex, últimas palavras.
Queria agradecer também a todos as quantidade de boas e relevantes informações que a gente generosamente colheu hoje dos nossos speakers, dos nossos palestrantes, muita sabedoria, muita inspiração para fazer o fruto hoje, para continuar o fruto amanhã, seja mais uma vez aqui, seja mais uma vez no Brasil, mas muitas vezes na Espanha. Obrigado a todo mundo, uma alegria, obrigado ao Basque Culinary Center por apoiar a gente, por dividir esse fruto conosco. É uma alegria poder estar no mundo junto com vocês.
Obrigado. E daqui a pouquinho, não se esqueça que vai ter uma mensagem aí do Basque, eles estão terminando de montar uma surpresa, então enquanto isso, deixa o recado. Vamos lá. Obrigado.
Estamos prontos, vamos lá.
Buenas noches. Muchas gracias por darnos también una oportunidad a los alumnos de participar en este evento y de aportar nuestro granito de arena. Nosotros somos la generación Z, los jóvenes nacidos entre 1994 y 2004. Para que os hagáis una idea, pues los jóvenes que tenemos ahora entre 16 y 26 años. Y tenemos un mensaje para vosotros. En primer lugar, agradeceros todo el trabajo que hacéis por mejorar nuestro futuro, nuestro día a día y nuestro modo de vida. Muchas gracias también por despertar nuestra conciencia gastronómica, cada uno a vuestra manera, a través del respeto de la biodiversidad y la cultura, a través del food design o a través de la creación de ecosistemas circulares. Y nosotros nos preguntamos, ¿dónde se encuentra nuestra generación en todos estos cambios?
Dado que nosotros trabajamos y aprendemos de vosotros y viviremos en vuestro legado, consideramos que tenemos que aportar algo. Desde ahora tenemos que trabajar juntos para construir un futuro justo y sostenible. Es por ello que nuestra generación tiene que alzar la voz para que se tome en cuenta en este gran cambio.
¿Y quiénes somos nosotros? Nos consideramos como la primera generación nativa digital, una generación supercomunicada y con una visión global del mundo. Estamos motivados, tenemos una gran capacidad de adaptación y una mente abierta a los cambios y transformaciones, pero también seremos los jóvenes que viviremos más de cerca las crisis climática, económica y social.
We think that our generation has a very clear view on what sustainable gastronomy should look like. First of all, among many other things, we think it's very important that everybody gets paid a decent amount of money, but also works a decent amount of hours. We also think that it's very important, especially for our generation, to know our biodiversity and also to use that and to reconnect with our gastronomical heritage. In addition, we think that it's essential not only to be sustainable, but also to be circular, so that we try to reinvent not only supply chains and food production chains, but entire systems to be waste-free and resilient by design. We also think that it's very important to have a common objective across the whole food chain and that we show that willingness to work together. And, well, not lastly, because there are many other things, but we also think that it's extremely important to have clear information on production chains, on the production of food, and for that information to be simple and clear and transparent, so that we know that when we buy food, we are supporting fair processes and that everybody that is involved in that process is being treated fairly.
Bueno, y parte de ese futuro, o como queremos verlo nosotros, creemos que es esencial incluir, bueno, todas las luchas sociales que ahora mismo mueven a nuestra sociedad y mueven a nuestra generación, porque desgraciadamente, y bueno, la realidad, la discriminación es el día a día, tanto pues a nivel sistémico como en nuestro sector, y desde el racismo, que no solo está presente en la producción de alimentos, sino también en nuestra dieta occidental y en nuestra cultura alimentaria, como siguen siendo todos los nombres la mayoría de los nombres de la gastronomía siguen siendo masculinos y seguimos siendo nosotras las que peores condiciones laborales tenemos que soportar y mayor acoso laboral tenemos. Entonces, también la sostenibilidad y la gastronomía tienen que hablar de feminismo, y al igual que hablar de feminismo, incluir a personas con distintas capacidades. En general, hacer accesible la gastronomía, ¿no? Esa gastronomía sostenible de la que hablamos, no a una élite, sino a todos. Es por tanto que este futuro incluye personas de todos los géneros, lugares, formas y colores y lo que sea, ¿no? Y le da las mismas oportunidades y los mismos derechos. Así que eso.
Ahora, más que nunca, estamos ansiosos en aprender, aportar y entender las diferentes culturas, personas y entornos que nos rodean. Cuando tomamos decisiones y queremos proporcionar nuevas miradas, lo hacemos con el futuro en mente. Estamos aquí dispuestos y motivados de aprender de vosotros y de todo el mundo que nos rodea, pero realmente queremos difundir este mensaje. Queremos difundir este mensaje para que cada vez sea más fuerte y global, pero a la vez sea unísono. Y pedimos y queremos ser parte de este mensaje. Queremos empezar a cambiar las cosas que hasta ahora se han hecho mal. Queremos romper con los esquemas que hasta ahora no se han podido romper. Es por ello que hacemos un llamamiento a toda nuestra generación, y gracias a una herramienta muy importante que tenemos todos nosotros, que es la conectividad, pedimos que nuestro mensaje se comparta tanto en redes sociales, universidades, paradas de autobuses, conversaciones del día a día, por un futuro más sostenible. Y no estamos solos.
For the environmental future and for the personal health of my clients, I work with a mostly plant-based diet.
Por un futuro sostenible intento ser consciente y concienciar a los de mi entorno sobre lo que conlleva tener todo a nuestro alcance, desde alimentos a ropa, y en base a eso tomar mejores decisiones.
Enseño y comunico cómo aplicar la sostenibilidad en el día a día.
Y yo, para ser sostenible, reciclo.
Es trabajar con la asociación Saretus, que es la red de consumo transformador en Donosti. Y bueno, lo que hacemos básicamente son dosieres, formaciones, talleres en relación a alternativas de consumo más responsables y conscientes en la ciudad de San Sebastián. Agur.
Lucho por los derechos de los trabajadores.
Hola, soy Teresa y por un futuro sostenible cultivo mis propios vegetales en casa.
Por un futuro sostenible ayudo a que mi piso se recicle.
Y para ayudar al medio ambiente, pues ocupo bolsa de tela en vez de bolsa de plástico.
Kaixo, soy Maite y para luchar contra el desperdicio de alimentos me organizo un menú semanal para así ir organizada la compra, tener una compra ajustada y evitar tirar comida.
Trato de consumir productos de temporada y locales y bueno, de hecho compramos en casa una cesta de productos kilómetro cero y de temporada.
Y como joven hostelero, lucho por unas condiciones dignas en mi entorno laboral.
Por un futuro sostenible da hostelería, consumo produtos de cercanía e promociono os produtos da miña terra.
To be sustainable, I help in the communal herb garden.
Un futuro sostenible, practico el autoconsumo de aceite en casa.
For the sustainable future, I suppose the local business which has sustainable business model.
And for a sustainable future, I recycle my trash and minimize plastic use.
En un futuro me gustaría tener mi propio restaurante y para un futuro más sostenible apoyo la inclusión social.
Por un futuro más sostenible es utilizar desechos de otros platos para crear nuevas técnicas.
Yo soy apasionada de la fotografía gastronómica y utilizo revistas digitales en lugar de físicas por un futuro sostenible.
Realizo recetas con el mínimo desperdicio, aprovechando al máximo el producto de cercanía y siempre hago la compra con bolsas de tela.
El futuro en el que queremos vivir. Nosotros queremos ser parte del cambio. Nosotros somos Gastronomy Changemakers. Eskerrik asko eta agur.
Je suis désolée. On pensait que ça n'arriverait qu'aux autres, qu'aux grands perdants de ce système, pas à nous autres privilégiés. Et nous voilà, au même titre que le reste de l'humanité, obligés de mettre notre monde sur pause, d'entrer consommateurs que nous sommes en hibernation forcée. Pour la première fois, on a décidé de ralentir cette course effrénée à la croissance, au nom de la vie. Nous sommes la première génération à vivre les conséquences du réchauffement climatique et la dernière à pouvoir y faire quelque chose. Je suis désolée. Drôle de destin que celui de cette génération Y. Drôle de sentiment que de se battre pour une guerre qu'on n'a pas nous-mêmes déclarée. C'est vrai. Je suis désolée. On n'y est pour rien. On n'était pas là quand ils ont décidé de couper les arbres pour en faire des billets, de sacrifier la moitié des animaux marins en 40 ans pour quelques points de croissance, d'enfermer la nature dans des parcs et de parquer le vivant dans des eaux. On n'était pas là quand ils ont décidé de trouer la couche d'ozone pour sentir bon nez dessous de bras, quand ils ont vidé les océans pour y mettre du plastique. On n'était pas là quand ils ont décidé que ça valait le coup de condamner certains à la misère pour nos t-shirts à 1 euro qu'on oublie au fond des placards, quand ils ont décidé que certains métiers valaient mieux que d'autres, que pour finir les fins de mois, il fallait mieux être designer ou start-upper que paysan, infirmier ou professeur. J'aimerais vous dire que ça va aller, qu'on peut continuer à binge-watcher Casa de Papel popcorn à la main pendant que nos décideurs s'occupent de faire tout le sale boulot. J'aimerais vous dire que la technologie sauvera le monde, que ces politiques en carton nous préparent autre chose qu'un avenir en porcelaine, que les grandes compagnies ont compris maintenant. Ça y est. Mais vous y croyez vraiment ? On n'y est pour rien. On n'y est pour rien et pourtant nous devenons complices. C'est notre faute parce qu'on s'est laissé endormir, doucement, à coups de fake news en intraveineuse. On a pris goût à leur confort. On s'est assoupi, bercé avec du progrès dans nos biberons. On a eu la flemme. L'inaction a le goût de pizza Deliveroo. Pendant qu'on produit, qu'on jette et qu'on recommence. Pendant qu'on like, qu'on share et qu'on stalk. Pendant qu'on se swipe à droite pour draguer et qu'on swipe up quand on a assez de followers, il y a les derniers éléphants d'Afrique. Les baleines qui s'étouffent sous le plastique. Les glaciers qui fondent et les forêts qui brûlent. La terre qui se consume à mesure que l'on consomme. Il est temps de débrancher des écrans et de rallumer les cerveaux. Comme à des enfants, on nous a raconté des histoires. On nous a dit qu'on était trop petits, que c'était déjà foutu. Montrons-leur qu'on a grandi. On nous dit à coups de tribunes, de pétitions, de tweets, que le monde d'après ne doit pas être un retour au monde d'avant, à la normale, parce que le normal ne marchait pas. Ce monde d'après, il nous appartient de le construire. Quand est-ce qu'on y va? Qu'on ose envoyer tout balader? Alors, il y a les États et leur inaction, les institutions et leur sommet, les multinationales et leurs yeux fermés. Mais aujourd'hui, j'aimerais vous proposer quelque chose. Et si on ne les attendait pas? Il va nous falloir du courage, de l'audace. Tant il va de soi qu'il est plus facile de crier au complot que de mettre les mains dans la terre. Tant il est plus confortable de dire que c'est sa faute, à l'autre, à lui, à eux. Il va falloir qu'on ose se poser la question. De quoi est-ce qu'on sera fier? En tant que génération, je veux dire. Est-ce qu'on sera fier de la 5G pour télécharger nos pornos en une fraction de seconde? De nos cartes du monde à gratter et épuisées d'avoir fait le Mexique, fait l'Inde, fait le Costa Rica? Est-ce qu'on sera fier du mascara waterproof ou des lunettes de réalité augmentée quand on devient aveugle à celles qu'on a sous les yeux? Ou est-ce qu'on sera fier d'appartenir à ceux qui ont réussi à dévier l'histoire? Confinés, en quarantaine dans un système malade, pour la première fois, on a appris que ne rien faire, c'était déjà agir. Alors comprenons que notre flemme canna-bol de céréales est une validation sournoise de ce modèle. Ne rien dire, c'est être d'accord. Ne rien faire, c'est ne pas vouloir que ça change. Voilà un pari bien risqué que de remettre notre sort entre les mains d'une poignée de boomers.
It's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. We need some global warming.
핵단추가 내 사무실 책상 위에 항상 놓여 있다는 것.
This is iPhone 10. It is the biggest leap forward since the original iPhone.
And to do that, the NSA specifically targets the communications of everyone. It ingests them by default.
And that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake. And I'm sorry.
À vous entendre, on devrait plonger dans la guerre civile, on devrait mettre des millions d'emplois en danger, si vous voulez, parce que l'apocalypse nous guette.
Make our planet great again.
Ne les laissons pas, par leur ignorance, par leur inaction, par leur nostalgie destructrice d'un monde qui s'éteint, choisir pour nous. Ils ont déconfiné nos corps, il va falloir déconfiner notre flemme. Nous, ceux dont le chez-soi ne s'arrête pas à un coin de rue ou à un lit d'hôpital. Nous les privilégiés. On a usé les coutures du canapé. On a fait péter les applis pour des abdos en béton. On a lu des bouquins à rendre vie nos tables de nuit. On a appris à faire du pain et à jouer de la guitare avec des tutos YouTube. On s'est fait des apéros pixelisés. On a enfin appelé nos grands-mères. On a laissé tomber les soutifs. On a appris à coudre des masques. Nous avons été des héros en pyjama. Nous avons sauvé des vies en pantoufles. Mais cette fois, il ne va pas s'agir de rester chez nous. Demain, il va nous falloir être encore plus courageux. Une nouvelle histoire nous attend dehors. Et croyez-moi, il va y avoir du boulot. Il va falloir se bouger, sortir dans les rues, pancarte à la main, mettre les mains dans la terre et la terre dans nos programmes scolaires, descendre des avions et se réconcilier avec le Luberon, laisser les énergies fossiles dans le sol, réduire nos 4 steaks hachés par semaine et nos sushis Deliveroo du samedi soir, enfourcher les vélos, éteindre la lumière en partant, débrancher des écrans, se reconnecter au vivant. Il va nous falloir être une génération intranquille, consciente et indignée. Qu'on soit plus que quelques-uns à être écolo. Drôle de case dans laquelle on a rangé ceux qui amassaient la vie pour se battre pour elle. Sauver la planète, protéger l'environnement, comme si on ne faisait pas partie de ce tout. Nous sommes des êtres vivants, au même titre que les autres que nous exterminons. Nous sommes la nature. Si elle disparaît, nous disparaissons avec elle. Si le jour d'après consiste simplement à refermer la parenthèse, à reprendre le cycle infernal qui a rendu possible ce virus, alors nous aurons perdu. Ça dépend de nous. Il nous appartient de prendre ce moment pour donner tort à tous ceux qui nous pensent trop petits, trop tard, trop fou. On sait déjà que ça ne sera pas facile et qu'on n'est même pas sûr de gagner. Mais franchement, est-ce que ça vaudrait pas le coup d'essayer ? On n'a plus le temps de ne pas y croire. Réveillons-nous.
Merci beaucoup d'avoir regardé cette vidéo, c'est la première vidéo de Pensée Sauvage. Et Pensée Sauvage du coup c'est Camille d'abord, que tu verras souvent à l'écran.
Et aussi Solène, je suis pas toute seule, le fameux réalisateur qui est derrière l'écran, vous verrez peut-être pas beaucoup. Mais pourtant on a voulu faire ça pour mêler un petit peu l'artistique et l'écologie. Donc on sait pas du tout si ça vous a plu ou pas, si c'est le cas dites-le nous dans les commentaires. Comme ça on sait si on continue ou si on fait juste une chaîne avec une seule vidéo quoi, finalement.
Et on voulait remercier l'équipe qui se compte en centaines de personnes.
Ouais, centaines de milliers de personnes.
Non, en vrai, on est donc 3, 4, on était vraiment très peu, on était là-haut. D'ailleurs, sur cette super montagne à l'autre bout du monde, voilà.
Pour vous, j'ai failli mourir de froid, littéralement. Il faisait moins 12 et j'étais à 5h du mat en débardeur, donc rien que pour ça, ça vaudrait le coup.
Ça valait le coup quand même. Donc, en tout cas, si vous voulez suivre nos aventures et les différents formats qu'on va faire, il y aura aussi d'autres choses avec plus podcast, peut-être un peu plus musical. En fait.
Raconte pas tout, ce sera une surprise. Donc si vous voulez savoir, en tout cas ce qu'il faut c'est
s'abonner.
Vous abonner et puis mettre la petite cloche, comme ça vous ne loupez pas les prochaines vidéos qui vont sortir. Et voilà. En tout cas, on espère vraiment que ça vous a plu.